Number 3. Russell Summary Car. In 1975, 20-year-old Michael Mansfield was attending Lincoln College in Lincoln, Illinois. For Christmas break, he returned to his family's Rolling Meadows, Illinois home. On New Year's Eve, Mansfield received a call, and he told his parents that he was going to meet a friend who lived in Arlington Heights. Sadly, he never returned home. 6 months later, on June 2, 1976, 51-year-old Ruth Martin of Lincoln, Illinois, didn't show up for work. On the floor of her garage, the police found blood and a .22 caliber bullet. Her car was found abandoned 2 days later in a hotel parking lot in Bloomington, Illinois. In the trunk, there was a lot of blood. The blood was tested and it was the same blood type as Martin's. The police searched for her, but she was nowhere to be found. Several months later, the investigations into both disappearances were at a standstill. At the time, the police had no reason to believe that the crimes were connected. The victims disappeared from different cities, they were different sexes and ages, and they didn't know each other when they were alive. Then, months later, on October 9, 1976, the police were called to the home of Jay and Robin Fry in Lincoln. They had been shot to death with a shotgun. Someone had forced them onto their knees, and Robin was shot first in the chest. Jay was shot next as he leaned over his wife. He was shot once in the abdomen and once in the head. Both of them were 25 years old, and Robin was 3 months pregnant with the couple's first child. The police were called and they interviewed some witnesses who heard the gunshots. They spoke to Jay's sister, and she saw a young man leaving their house shortly after the gunshots were heard. The police learned that Jay Fry was going to testify in court against 21-year-old Russell Semrikar of Joliet, Illinois. Semrikar was due in court for a traffic violation 9 days after the murders. When he arrived at the courthouse, Jay's sister identified him as the man who she saw leaving her brother's house. The police also realized that Jay Fry wasn't the only person who was set to testify against Semrikar that possibly met with an untimely death. Ruth Martin was also supposed to testify at the same trial, and Michael Mansfield disappeared 6 days before he was going to testify against Semrikar on different charges. While killing witnesses before they had a chance to testify seems like a logical motive, what the police had a hard time wrapping their heads around was why Semrikar felt that he needed to kill the witnesses in his cases. Mansfield went to school with Semrikar, and he was caught with records and a guitar that Semrikar had stolen from another dorm room. The police arrested Mansfield for possession of stolen goods and offered him a deal. The charges against him would be dropped if he testified against Semrikar for theft, and Mansfield took the deal. As for Semrikar's second trial, it stemmed from an incident at Kroger's grocery store in Lincoln. Semrikar walked out of the store with stolen goods, and Jay Fry, an employee at the store, chased after him. As Semrikar ran, he threw the stolen goods under Ruth Martin's car. Both Jay Fry and Ruth Martin were set to testify against Semrikar for shoplifting. The stolen goods were 2 ribeye steaks that cost $4. Robin Fry was killed just because she happened to be with her husband when Semrikar went to kill him. Semrikar was charged with the murders of Jay and Robin Fry, and while he was in jail waiting trial, he tried to arrange a hit on Jay's sister, who was going to testify against him. His cellmates snitched on him, and the hit was never carried out. Semrikar was found guilty, and he was given 2 sentences of 100 to 300 years in prison. Since the bodies of Mansfield and Martin were still missing, Semrikar wasn't charged with their murders, although he was the prime suspect. As Semrikar sat in prison, he denied being involved in their disappearances. Then, in October 2011, Semrikar, who was 56 years old and terminally ill, started to tell a news story. He confessed to investigators that he killed Mansfield, but he didn't tell them where his body was. He said that he killed Martin and he buried her under Interstate 55, which was under construction at the time. He said that he killed her on the day that he kidnapped her and buried her that night. Since he buried her at night, he couldn't remember the exact location of the body. Unfortunately, the bodies of Michael Mansfield and Ruth Martin have never been found. The police continue to look for their bodies, but they consider the murders solved. Number 2. Geraldine Kelly. Geraldine and John Kelly grew up in a rough neighborhood in Somerville, Massachusetts. The couple married young, and in 1970 and 1971, Geraldine gave birth, first to a daughter and then a son. The couple would argue often, especially after John had been drinking. In 1981, the couple was attending the wedding of a family member, and John, once again, drank too much. A brawl broke out between 4 men, and one of them was John. When the fighting was done, John's brother-in-law was dead. The death created problems for John with the rest of his family and with the law. He was certain that he was going to be indicted, so he decided to move his family away from Somerville. They bounced around for a while before ending up in Ventura, California, working at a motel beside Highway 101. Geraldine ran the front desk, and John, who was a trained plumber, did maintenance around the motel. In 1989, the kids, who were 18 and 19, moved out, and eventually they became estranged from their parents. The main reason that they moved out was because John and Geraldine fought often, and John was abusive at times. In early 1992, the owners of the motel noticed that John wasn't around anymore. Geraldine said that he had to go out of town, and while he was out of town, he was hit by a car and killed. She called her children and told them a similar story. Geraldine continued to manage the motel for 6 more years. In 1998, she decided to move back to her hometown, Somerville. In November of that year, Geraldine was dying of breast cancer. Her estranged daughter came to her bedside, and Geraldine made a startling confession. She said that she killed John, which isn't exactly that shocking. What was shocking was the location of the body. She said that his body was in a freezer in a storage unit in Somerville. When Geraldine moved across the country months earlier, she sealed the freezer with duct tape, and she had it shipped with the rest of her stuff. The truck driver had no idea that there was a body in the freezer. After Geraldine died on November 18th, her daughter contacted the police. They found John's mummified remains in the freezer. He had been shot once in the back of the head. The bullet, fired from a .38 caliber handgun, was still in his skull. In the home where Geraldine last lived, they found the murder weapon. Like her husband, she held on to it for 6 years. Number 1. Brian Squires. 14-year-old Gina Brooks spent the evening of August 5th, 1989, watching her brother's baseball game. After the game, she returned home with her family to their Fredericktown, Missouri house, and she left again on her bike sometime between 10 o'clock and 10:30. She was going to see her boyfriend, who lived 6 blocks away. When Gina didn't return home by 2:30 a.m., her frantic mother, who didn't know she left on her bike, called the police. The neighborhood was searched, and her bike was found abandoned on a road about 5 blocks from her home. The last confirmed sighting of Gina was near a church not far from where her bike was found. 3 men in a light green, blue, or gray station wagon were following her, and they pulled up beside her at the church. They tried to talk to her as she stood beside her bike, but then she got on her bike and started to ride away. A few people, including her boyfriend, heard some screams and saw the station wagon speed off towards the highway. Sadly, no trace of Gina has ever been found, and it scarred the small town of Fredericktown, which had a population of only 4,000 people. For years the case sat cold, and then it took an unusual turn in September 1996. A man named Brian Squires was dying from cancer and AIDS-related complications in a St. Louis, Missouri hospital. In his last days, he told several nurses some horrible stories that he felt he had to get off his chest. These stories revolved around several horrifying murders. The first murder he admitted to was the murder of Gina Brooks. He said that he was the driver of the station wagon that night. Squires said that he and two other men, Nathan Williams and Timothy Ballou, kidnapped her. Squires claimed that Williams slit Gina's throat, and then he and Ballou disposed of the body. Squires also admitted to kidnapping 9-year-old Angie Houseman, who disappeared on November 18, 1993, from St. Anne, which is a suburb of St. Louis. Squires said that he and another man kidnapped her after she got off the school bus. Her body was found tied to a tree 9 days after she went missing. She had been tortured and she died from exposure. Who Squires' accomplice was is unknown, but it wasn't Williams. Williams was in prison at the time for raping a minor. However, Squires did say that Williams was involved in another murder. He said that in 1975, Williams killed 23-year-old Laura Dinwiddie. Dinwiddie, who was a volunteer that worked with deaf inner-city kids in St. Louis, was found dead in her apartment. She had been stabbed and her throat was slit. She was nude, but she had not been raped. Williams was 14 years old at the time of the murder. Squires died not long after making the confessions. In 1999, the police charged Ballou and Williams with the murder of Gina. Williams was also charged in the murder of Dinwiddie. The FBI interviewed Ballou, who had a history of sex crimes, and he said that Gina's body was in a freezer, and the freezer was buried on his father's 96-acre property. The FBI searched the property, but they didn't find any traces of Gina. In 1999, the murder charge against Ballou was dropped, and instead he was charged with lying to the FBI. He was convicted and he was sentenced to 30 months in prison. Then, both murder charges against Williams were dropped as well. The district attorney said that they believe he is responsible for both murders, but they didn't have enough evidence to proceed with the trials. Squires' deathbed confessions are not admissible in court because he only told the nurses and not the police. The nurses didn't call the police because they didn't think that Squires was telling the truth. Williams is currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 30 years in both sentences for raping a 10-year-old girl a month and a day after Gina went missing. He is also the prime suspect in the disappearance of 12-year-old Tammy Surdam. Tammy went missing from St. Charles, Missouri on August 1, 1975. She was constantly running away from home, so her family didn't report her missing right away. However, after not hearing from her for years, they think she met with foul play. Williams told 2 different people that in the 1970s he kidnapped a girl in St. Charles. He raped her, stabbed her to death, and then buried her body. Like Gina, Tammy's body has never been found. While Williams has been implicated in 2 disappearances and 1 murder, and has bragged about committing 8 other murders to different witnesses, he has never been convicted of a single murder. He is currently incarcerated in Jefferson City Correctional Center. Number 3. Joan Harrison. On November 23, 1975, Joan Harrison, a 26-year-old mother of 2, was found in a garage in Preston, which is an area in northeast London, England. Harrison had been addicted to morphine, and she worked as a sex worker. She had been kicked and stomped to death after she was sexually assaulted. The police conducted a major investigation into the murder, but it turned up nothing. Then in March 1978, the lead investigator of the Yorkshire Ripper Task Force received a letter from a person claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper. By this point, the man dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper had killed 8 women. The first murder happened on October 30th, 1975, about 3 weeks before Joan Harrison was killed. 28-year-old mother of 4 and sex worker, Wilma McCain, had been hit with a hammer and stabbed to death in Leeds. 2.5 months later, 42-year-old Emily Jackson, who worked as a part-time sex worker, was found murdered in Leeds. She had been sexually assaulted, hit multiple times in the head with a hammer, and stabbed 52 times with a screwdriver. On May 9, 1976, a 20-year-old woman in Leeds was attacked, but she survived. It would be nearly a year before there was another attack. Then on February 5, 1977, 28-year-old Irene Richardson was found beaten with a hammer and stabbed to death in Leeds. Like the other victims, she was a sex worker. 2.5 months later, Patricia Atkinson, a 32-year-old sex worker, was found beaten and stabbed to death in her apartment in Bradford. On June 26, 1977, about 2 months after the last murder, 16-year-old Jane McDonald was killed near a playground in Leeds after a night out with friends. Unlike the other victims, Jane was not a sex worker. But just like the other victims, she had been sexually assaulted, beaten with a hammer, and stabbed multiple times. About 3 months later, on the night of October 9, 1997, a woman's body was found in an isolated area in Manchester. She was identified as Jean Jordan, who was 20 years old and worked as a sex worker. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. She had probably been beaten in the head with a hammer. Then over a week later, her body had been stabbed. The police suspected that the killer went back to the body, possibly to retrieve something that he left behind, and for some unknown reason, he stabbed the body. 4 months later, there was another murder in Bradford. On January 31, 1981, an 18-year-old sex worker named Helen Reika was found in Huddersfield, beaten to death with a hammer. Then on March 8, 1981, the letter arrived at the office of the Yorkshire Ripper Task Force. In the letter, the author said he planned to rid the streets of sex workers. He also took credit for killing Tracy MacDonald and for killing Joan Harrison. 5 days later, the newspaper, the Daily Mirror, received a letter from the same writer, and he once again took credit for the murder of Harrison. He then went on to write that most of the victims had been young, but he would kill an older woman next. Both letters were signed off with the name Jack the Ripper. Before the letters, the police did not think that the Yorkshire Ripper was responsible for the murder of Joan Harrison. But she was a sex worker who was beaten to death, so after the letters, the police thought it was possible that she could have been one of his victims. Just over 2 weeks after the second letter was received, on March 26, 1978, the body of a young woman was found in a field in Bradford. She was identified as 21-year-old Yvonne Pearson, a sex worker. She went missing 2 months earlier on January 21, 1978, 10 days before Helen Reika was killed. Pearson had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head. Under one of her arms was a copy of the February 21, 1978 edition of the Daily Mirror. It is suspected that the killer went back to the body a month after the murder and put the newspaper under her arm. Then on May 16, 1978, sex worker Vera Millward was beaten and stabbed to death in Manchester. She was the first woman to be murdered after the letters had been received. The author of the letters was correct. Millward was older than the average victim. She was 40 years old. Since she was the first victim to be killed after the letters, the police thought that the author really was the killer. But there was one oddity. In the first letter, the author wrote that the police were incorrect when they said he had only killed 7 women. He said he had killed an 8th woman, Joan Harrison. But by the time the letters were mailed, the Yorkshire Ripper had killed Helen Rika, and her body had just not been found. The author does not mention Rika in either letter. Why would the author brag about committing one murder the police didn't connect to the Yorkshire Ripper case, but not write about another murder that he supposedly committed just weeks before the letters were sent? Nevertheless, the police thought that there was enough valid information in the letters to believe that they were written by the Yorkshire Ripper. The rest of 1978 was a quiet one for the Ripper. Then in March 1979, a year after receiving the first letter, the head of the Yorkshire Ripper Task Force received another letter from a man claiming to be the Ripper. In the letter, the author wrote that he knew that Vera Millward had spent time in the hospital before she was killed. The police didn't think that this was common knowledge, but they thought it was something that the killer might have known. This further convinced them that the author was the Yorkshire Ripper. On April 4th, 1979, less than 2 weeks after the task force received the letter, the Ripper struck again. This time he beat and stabbed 19-year-old Josephine Whitaker to death. Whitaker was not a sex worker. Instead, she was a clerk at a mortgage company. She was attacked in Halifax as she was walking home after visiting her grandparents. 2 months after that murder, the task force received an audio cassette from the writer of the letters. On the recording, a man taunts the police and says that he will kill again. The man had a Sutherland accent, which is a city north of London. Because of the recording, the police started looking for a suspect that lived or at least grew up in Sutherland. 5 months after the task force received the tape, on September 2nd, 1979, 20-year-old university student Barbara Leach was walking home after spending the evening at a pub with some friends in Bradford. The next day, her body was found about 200 yards from where her friends last saw her. Like Josephine Whitaker, she had been beaten with a hammer and stabbed with a screwdriver. On August 21st, 1980, nearly a year after the last murder, the body of 47-year-old Marguerite Walls was found not far from her home in Leeds. She was attacked the night before after she left her job as a civil servant. She had worked late that night because she was planning on leaving on vacation the next morning. She was hit with a hammer and then strangled to death. On the night of November 17, 1980, about 3 months after the last murder, a 20-year-old university student named Jacqueline Hill was walking from the bus to her home. Someone found her handbag not far from the bus stop, and it was splattered with blood, so they called the police. The police found her body a few hundred feet from the bag. She had been stabbed with a screwdriver and beaten with a hammer. 1.5 months later, on January 2nd, 1981, a police officer came upon a couple in their car in a red light district in Broom Hill. He ran the license plate of the car, and it turned out that the license plates were stolen. The couple was ordered to get out of the car. The driver of the car was identified as 34-year-old Peter Sutcliffe, and the woman was a sex worker. Sutcliffe was arrested for the stolen license plates. At the police station, officers immediately noticed that Sutcliffe looked a lot like the sketches of the Yorkshire Ripper. He was interviewed for 2 days, during which time his home and his vehicle were extensively searched. Then, nearly 48 hours after he was arrested, Sutcliffe started confessing. In total, he admitted to killing 13 women. One murder that he did not confess to was the murder of Joan Harrison. Sutcliffe also said that he didn't write the letters, nor did he record the tape. The police know that Sutcliffe was born and raised in London, and he did not have a Sutherland accent. DNA testing would later confirm that Sutcliffe was telling the truth. His DNA did not match the DNA found on Joan Harrison, nor did it match the DNA found on the letters. Also, the DNA found on Joan Harrison did not match the DNA that was found on the letters either. In 2005, the DNA found under the seal of one of the envelopes was inputted into the United Kingdom National DNA Database. It was matched to an unemployed alcoholic named John Humble. Humble was not involved in the Yorkshire Ripper murders, nor was he involved in the murder of Joan Harrison. The letters in the audio cassette were just a disturbing hoax. Humble was ultimately sentenced to 8 years of prison for sending the letters and the tape. Then in February 2011, the police announced that Joan Harrison's murder had been solved. 3 years earlier, in January 2008, a man named Christopher Smith had been arrested for drinking and driving. Smith had a violent criminal history. In 1981, he was convicted of attempted sexual assault on a 17-year-old girl. For the conviction, he served 2 years and 9 months in prison. Not long after he was released, his pregnant wife, Violet, was found dead from a stab wound. Smith was charged with her murder, and in 1984 he went to trial. At his trial, Smith said that he and Violet were having an argument and she fell onto the knife. He was convicted of manslaughter and he was given a suspended sentence. When he was arrested for drinking and driving in 2006, a sample of his DNA was taken. His DNA was entered into the database and it was matched to the DNA taken from Joan Harrison's murder. But the match came too late. 6 days after he was arrested for drinking and driving, Smith died from lung cancer. In his possession, his family found a 3-page deathbed confession that he wrote the day before he died. The letter had several grammatical and spelling mistakes, so the following reading is what Smith intended to say instead of a word-for-word reading. His letter reads, "To who it concerns, I would like to put the record straight. I can't go on with the guilt. I have lived with it for over 20 years. I am truly sorry for all the pain I have caused to anyone. Please believe me when I say I am sorry. I love my grandkids and my daughter. I cannot go back to prison anymore. Please God, help my family who I worship. I have been out of trouble for over 20 years, so please God, help me. I am so sorry. God forgive me. I love you all forever." The police said that even though Smith doesn't flat out say he killed Harrison in the letter, he shows remorse for something that he was never arrested for. Since his DNA was linked to Joan Harrison's murder, they are sure he was referring to her murder throughout the letter. Smith's family said he was always paranoid and he would become frightened anytime someone knocked on the door. The police said that if Smith had not died, based on the DNA, they would have charged him with the murder of Joan Harrison. The police went on to say that it's regretful that Smith didn't face justice, but they hope that learning who killed her will give Joan Harrison's family a small amount of closure. Number 2. Brenda Sue Brown. In 1966, Brenda Sue Brown was 11 years old. She was the oldest of 7 children, and 3 years earlier, her family had moved to Shelby, North Carolina. At 8 o'clock a.m. on July 27, 1966, it was already hot in Shelby. Brenda Sue and her sisters spent the early morning fighting over a makeup compact. At about 8:30 a.m., Brenda Sue's mother asked her to walk her sister to a preschool class. Brenda Sue was supposed to come right back home after she dropped off her sister, but she didn't. About an hour after she left the house, Brenda Sue's mother started searching the neighborhood for her. She looked for over an hour, but she found no trace of Brenda Sue, and an official search team was formed. Then, about 11 hours later, Brenda Sue's body was found in a thicket just a short distance from her house. She was partially clothed, but she had not been sexually assaulted. Her skull had been fractured in a dozen places. Not far from her body was a blood-covered rock. It's believed that she was beat to death with the rock. The police immediately had two suspects. One was a bald-headed man who exposed himself to Brenda Sue's sister a few days earlier as she walked to her preschool class, but the police were never able to identify the man. The second was a 13-year-old African-American boy named Robert Roseborough. He lived about a few hundred feet from where Brenda Sue's body was found. Several witnesses saw him in the area where Brenda Sue's body was found around the time that she was killed. The police questioned Robert, but he refused to answer their questions. The police thought that Robert was the killer, but they couldn't prove anything, so he wasn't charged. 2 years later, on the morning of June 22, 1968, a mother and daughter went to a custom towel shop in Shelby, but found the door locked. They looked in through a window, and lying on the ground was the nude body of a woman in a pool of blood. A young man also appeared to be in the store. The mother and daughter called the police, and they arrived a few minutes later. They ordered the man to come outside. He refused, so the police threw a tear gas canister into the store. This forced the young man out of the store, and he was arrested. It was Robert Roseborough, who was now 15 years old. The woman inside the store was already dead. She was identified as the owner of the store, 35-year-old Mary Helen Williams. She had been beaten and stabbed multiple times. Although she was nude, she had not been sexually assaulted. Robert said he was innocent and he had no reason to kill Williams. But besides finding him in the store alone with a dead body, the police also found blood on his clothes and the victim's cigarette lighter in his pocket. In May 1969, Robert went to trial for the murder of Williams. An all-white jury found him guilty, and even though he was 15 at the time of the murder, he was sentenced to death. Robert appealed his conviction and death sentence several times, and eventually, his death sentence was commuted to a life sentence. The people of Shelby saw similarities between the murders of Brenda Sue Brown and Mary Helen Williams. For example, both were beaten and both were at least partially undressed, but they had not been sexually assaulted. Also, Robert Roseborough had been the prime suspect in Brenda Sue's murder. So everyone just assumed that Robert had killed Brenda Sue. And for 40 years, this is what most people in Shelby believed. Then in 2005, two of Brenda Sue's sisters met with the Shelby Police Department and asked them to reopen the case. Officers looked through the evidence room, but they couldn't find most of the evidence from Brenda Sue's murder. They could only locate one piece of evidence, and it was a bloody palm print that was found on Brenda Sue's shoe. In the hope that more evidence would be found, the sisters agreed to have Brenda Sue's body exhumed. They dug up her casket, but the remains were just some bones, so no new evidence was found. The next year, a reporter with the newspaper, the Shelby Star, did a 13-segment story about Brenda Sue's murder. Not long after the articles were published, a woman named Laura Lale got in contact with the Shelby Police Department. She told them in late June 2002, her 74-year-old grandfather, Earl Mickey Parker, was dying in a hospital in Shelby. Just before he died, she was sitting with him alone, and he told her that he had done some horrible things in his life, and he had to get something off his chest before he died. Parker said the night before Brenda Sue was killed, he and another man named Thurman Price met at Bootlegger's house in Shelby, and they spent the night there. The next morning, he and Price were walking home, and they happened upon Brenda Sue, who was walking home after she dropped off her sister. Price grabbed Brenda Sue, and he carried her to the thicket. When they got to the thicket, an African-American boy was already there. Price yelled at him to go home, and the boy ran off. It's believed that this boy was Robert Roseborough. The plan was to sexually assault Brenda Sue, but she started to fight with Price, and she scratched his face. So Price picked up a rock, and he hit her in the face with it. Price then told Parker that they needed to kill her, or they would be in serious trouble. Then Price used the rock to beat her to death. Not long after he confessed the murder to his granddaughter, Parker died. The police said that the deathbed confession was consistent with reports from the crime scene. Also, Parker and Price had committed a similar crime in 1954, 12 years before Brenda Sue's murder. They had sexually assaulted a 12-year-old girl in Patterson Springs, North Carolina. That time, they did not kill the girl. They pleaded guilty to sexual assault, and they were sentenced to 3 to 5 years suspended, which meant they received no jail time. In February 2007, the police arrested Thurman Price, who was 79 years old, and he was living a short distance from the crime scene. Price swore he was innocent. The only evidence against him was the deathbed confession, who Parker only supposedly made to one person, which was his granddaughter. Price's lawyer argued that the deathbed confession should be inadmissible, but a judge decided that it could be used as evidence. However, Thurman Price would never go to trial for Brenda Sue's murder. In August 2012, at the age of 83, Price died while awaiting trial. He never admitted to being involved in the murder of Brenda Sue Brown. Number 1. The Crazy Brabant Killers. Brabant was a province in central Belgium. People in the area primarily speak 2 languages, French and Dutch. In 1995, the province was split into 2 regions and 1 autonomous area. The northern part of the province, which is the Dutch-speaking area, is now known as Flemish Brabant, while the southern French-speaking region is called Walloon Brabant. The autonomous area is the capital, Brussels, and it is bilingual. Back in the early to mid-1980s, when it was still one province, Brabant was plagued by a horrifying crime spree. The first known crime committed by the Crazy Brabant Killers actually didn't happen in Brabant. It happened in Dinant, which is located in the neighboring Belgian province of Namur. On March 13, 1982, 2 men slipped into an arms dealer in the city's busy shopping district. They grabbed a rifle with a long barrel that is commonly used to hunt ducks. The owner of the store saw the 2 men as they were leaving, but he didn't get a good look at them. The 2 men were seen getting into a car, and they clipped the car as they drove away, but they didn't stop. About a month later, it's believed that the same 2 men stole a Volkswagen Santana from a dealership's showroom floor in Limbeck, which is a village in Brabant. 3 months later, 2 men broke into a closed grocery store in Montbéliard, France. They got into the store by breaking a glass door, and this aroused the attention of a person living near the grocery store. That person called the police, and 3 officers arrived on the scene. The 2 robbers started firing at the police, and the officers returned fire. 1 officer was shot, and then the 2 robbers got into a VW Santana, and they drove away. The officer who was shot survived the shooting. Money did not seem to be the motive of the break-in. Instead, the 2 men stole random things like wine and coffee. About a month and a half later, on September 30th, 1982, 3 armed men entered an armory in Brabant. Inside the armory were the owner and 2 customers. All 3 were beaten and tied up. The 3 men grabbed 15 guns and ammunition, but they didn't grab the guns at random. Instead, they appeared to know what guns they wanted, and they took the ammo that corresponded with the guns. A 33-year-old police officer named Claude Halud was patrolling the area, and he was alerted that there was a robbery in progress. He went to the armory, and as he approached, he was shot twice in the chest and once in the head. The 3 men then got into a VW Santana and sped off. Down the road from the armory, 2 officers used their car as a roadblock, but the VW Santana plowed into their car. The robbers then got into a gunfight with the police, and the 2 officers were shot. The robbers then got back into the Santana and drove off. Later that night, they torched the Santana. Officer Claude Halud died from his wounds, but the other 2 officers survived the shooting. Another crime that may be connected to the Brabant killers was the disappearance of Francis Swartz. Swartz was a security guard, and on October 26, 1982, he was transporting gold and documents. That night, he vanished without a trace, and he has never been found. The goods he was transporting also disappeared. He is not considered an official victim of the Brabant killers, but some people think that his disappearance is connected to the gang. On the morning of December 24, 1982, the son of Jose Vandenade found him dead in a room that he rented at an inn in Brabant. The 72-year-old had died a horrible death. He had been tied to his bed and tortured. He was killed when he was shot 7 times in the head with a pistol. It's thought that his killers ate, drank, and even played a game during the night that they stayed in his room. Nothing appeared to be stolen from his room. Then, 3 weeks later, Angelo Constantine, a 58-year-old cab driver, was found shot to death in the trunk of his cab. It's thought that he was killed by a passenger or passengers that he picked up. Like Jose Vandenade, he had been shot multiple times in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. The 2 victims were connected in other ways. Notably, they had worked for the same taxi company. Also, they knew each other because they had both been involved in far-right political groups. The police looked into the possibility that the 2 men were assassinated because of their political views, but that line of investigation did not turn up any leads. On February 11, 1983, 3 men wearing masks robbed a grocery store in Jeanval, Brabant. This time, they didn't kill anyone. They escaped in a Peugeot 504 that they had stolen days earlier. 3 days after the robbery, 2 men in a Peugeot 504 carjacked a woman driving a VW Golf. The Peugeot 504 was later found torched. On February 24, 1983, two men driving a VW Golf robbed a grocery store in Fort Jacko, which isn't in the Brabant province. It is in the nearby province of Uke. Once again, no one was killed in the robbery. A week later, there was another grocery store robbery. 3, or possibly 4 masked men entered a store in Halle, Brabant. This time, the manager of the store, Walter Verstappen, was killed after he was shot in the neck. The robbers got away in a VW Golf. Verstappen was pronounced dead at the hospital. On June 9, 1983, several men went to a car lot in Brabant, Brabant, and they stole a Saab 900 Turbo. The only casualty was a guard dog that was shot 11 times. During the summer of 1983, the crazy Brabant killers were quiet. Then on September 10, 1983, there was a break-in at a textile factory in Temse, which is in the province of East Flanders. At least 2 men entered the textile factory, and they shot the caretaker, 26-year-old Joseph Broders, and his wife, 25-year-old Linda Van Huffelen. The 2 robbers took 7 high-quality bulletproof vests. A person who lived near the factory heard the gunshots, and he saw 2 men get into a Saab 900 Turbo and drive away. The witness who heard the gunshots called for help, and Broders and Van Huffelen were rushed to the hospital. Broders was pronounced dead not long after arriving at the hospital. Van Huffelen was in a coma for several weeks, but she ultimately survived. On September 7, 1983, a week after the textile factory robbery, the police were called to a grocery store in Brabant because the store's alarm had been triggered. When officers arrived at the grocery store, they were immediately hit with a barrage of bullets. 31-year-old officer Marcel Moreau was killed, and another officer was seriously injured. After the gunfight, the robbers made their getaway. The police looked around the grocery store, and they found 2 dead bodies. 49-year-old Jacques Ferrez and his girlfriend, Elise DeWitt, who was also 49, had both been shot in the head. They had stopped at a gas station near the grocery store around the time of the robbery. Their white Mercedes-Benz had been stolen by the killers. This robbery was odd because of the items that were stolen from the grocery store. Notably, the robbers didn't take any money. Instead, they stole some coffee, 5 cans of corn oil, 5 cans of peanut oil, and some pralines. Just after midnight on October 2, 1983, about 2 weeks after the grocery store robbery, the staff at a restaurant in Halle, Brabant were closing up for the night. As they were closing up, 2 masked men with guns forced their way into the restaurant. They made all the employees lie down on the floor, and then they forced the owner, Jacques Van Camp, to go outside. Once they were outside, Van Camp was shot in the neck, and then the killers drove off in his daughter's VW Golf. Van Camp died at the scene. 5 days later, the stolen VW Golf with 3 men inside of it pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store in Beersel, Brabant. When they got out of the car, they were all wearing masks. 2 of them were armed with guns, while the 3rd man was carrying a Viking axe. They grabbed a man who was walking out of the store and used him as a hostage. With a gun held to his neck, they led him into the store. Inside the store, one of the men shot a cashier. 42-year-old Freddie Vermeulen, the manager of the store, heard the gunshot, and he came out of the office to see what the noise was. When he did, he was shot as well. 2 cashiers and a customer were also hit with projectiles, but only Vermaelen died. The masked men grabbed some money out of the office, then they walked out of the grocery store. They got into their stolen VW Golf and drove off into the night. They left their hostage unscathed. The gang went strike again for a month and a half. And on December 1st, 1983, 3 armed men entered a jewelry store in Anderlecht, Brabant. They shot to death the owner of the store, 43-year-old Jean Music, and his wife, 38-year-old Maria Christina Slomak. The 3 men stole some jewelry and a revolver, and then they piled into a VW Golf and drove away. The burnt-out shell of the VW Golf, which was stolen from the restaurant 2 months earlier, was found later that night. After the robbery at the jewelry store, the gang seemed to go quiet, and the people of Belgium started to breathe a little bit easier. In 1984, there wasn't a single attack associated with the crazy Brabant killers. Most people assumed that they, or at least an integral member of the gang, had been arrested and jailed for another crime. Then, on the night of September 21st, 1985, a VW Golf was stolen from a car lot in Earps-Corps, Brabant. 6 nights later, 3 men in a stolen VW Golf pulled up to a grocery store in Braine-l'Alleud, Brabant. The 3 men emerged from the car wearing masks and carrying guns. One of the men grabbed a 12-year-old boy who was standing outside the store and used him as a hostage as they made their way into the store. When they got inside, they shot 39-year-old customer Ghislain Plantain. Plantain had confronted the man about using a young child as a hostage. He would be later pronounced dead at the scene. The gunman ordered the rest of the customers to get on the floor. They didn't think that 45-year-old customer Roger Engelman was moving fast enough, so he was shot and killed as well. 2 of the gunmen grabbed some money, and then the 3 men, along with their 12-year-old hostage, exited the store. When they got outside, they found 43-year-old Bozdar Jarosky sitting in his van. He had been waiting for family members who were inside the store shopping. The gang shot and killed him as well. Then the 3 men piled into the VW Golf and drove away. They left their 12-year-old hostage physically unharmed. Unfortunately, the gang wasn't finished for the night. 10 miles away from the grocery store, 3 men wearing masks parked their car near another grocery store in Overijse, Brabant. Before they even got into the store, they shot 2 people, 14-year-old Stefan Nod and 31-year-old Luc Bennekens. Both died from their injuries. Once they were inside the grocery store, they shot and killed 2 customers, 55-year-old Leon Finn and Jean-Pierre Busset. They ordered one of the cashiers, 37-year-old Rosa Van Klindock, to open her register. She started to open the register, but they thought she was moving too slowly, so they shot her to death as well. Then they grabbed some money and fled the scene. In total, that night, they killed 8 people. A month and a half later, on November 8, 1985, 3 armed men who were dressed like soldiers and had scarves over their faces parked their car near a grocery store in Aalst, a city in the province of East Flanders. As they neared the store, they opened fire on a family of 4. 43-year-old Gilbert Van de Steen, his 39-year-old wife, Teresa, and their 14-year-old daughter, Rebecca, were all killed. 9-year-old Thomas Van de Steen was the only family member to survive the shooting. The 3 men then entered the store through the back, and they started firing at anything that moved. This included shooting 28-year-old Dirk Niels and his 9-year-old daughter, Els. 33-year-old Marie-Jeanne Van Mulder, 62-year-old George de Smet, and 42-year-old Jan Polsterman were also shot. All 5 of them died because of their wounds. Besides the 8 people who were killed, 15 other people were injured. As the 3 men walked back to their car, the police started to descend on the area. The gang fired at the police, and the police returned fire. The police were sure that at least one of the men was shot and suffered a fatal wound. But all 3 of them managed to get into the car. The men drove away from the scene, and the police chased them, but eventually they lost track of the car. The car was found a few days later. Like the other vehicles, it had been set on fire. The 8-person massacre was the last crime attributed to the crazy Brabant killers. Over 3 years, it's believed that they killed 28 people, with Francis Warts being a possible 29th victim. Often, the witnesses' descriptions of the gang members were slightly different, but there was a general consensus about the 3 men who all spoke French. One of the gang members is nicknamed the Giant. He was described as being between 6'4" and 6'6", and he was thin. It's believed that he was the leader of the gang. Another member of the gang was given the nickname the Old Man. He was described as a man in his 50s who was short, and he often acted as a getaway driver. The 3rd gang member is called the Killer. The Killer was about 6 feet tall, with dark hair and a dark complexion. He got his nickname because he committed most of the group's murders. It's believed that the Killer was the gang member who was shot in the getaway from the final robbery. The police think that the Killer either died as a result of his gunshot, or his fellow gang members killed him after he was shot by the police because they couldn't take him to the hospital without exposing themselves. However, as of right now, this is speculation because the killer's body has never been found. Or if his body has been found, he wasn't identified as the killer. Over the years, there have been several theories as to the identity of the gang members and what their motivations could have been. While they did steal items and money, theft didn't seem to be the primary motivation behind the reign of terror. One theory is that the gang was somehow connected to the gendarmerie, which was a paramilitary group that was the police force in Belgium at the time. There are 3 main reasons why people believe this theory. The first is that the gang members seem to have police or military training. Secondly, at times, they seem to have inside knowledge of the gendarmerie's operations. For example, the gang members seem to know where the roadblocks were because they avoided them. The third reason is that the gendarmerie was never able to catch or identify the men. Since the gang members were never identified, there is a conspiracy theory that the gendarmerie supposedly let the killers get away with their crimes. However, critics of this theory point out that several members of the gendarmerie were killed and many more were injured during the crime spree. Experts who have done research on the case said that the gendarmerie was dysfunctional, but there wasn't some conspiracy that allowed the gang to escape justice. Errors in this case, and in the Marc Dureau case, which we cover in the video 3 Killer Couples, led to the formation of a new federal police force in Belgium. Another theory is that the gang was made up of members of the far left or the far right, and they were trying to undermine the government. Officials with the police have said that they have not ruled out this possibility. Then in October 2017, 32 years after the last and most deadly raid, an unidentified man told a broadcaster in Belgium that his brother, Christian Wanowski, was the Giant. Wanowski was a member of the Diane Group, which was an elite commando squad in the gendarmerie. In 1981, Wanowski was dismissed from the group, and he was transferred to a police station in Allsp. He had been dismissed because there had been an incident where his gun accidentally fired. His brother said he was bitter about the dismissal, and he started drinking. He drank so much that he died in May 2015 at the age of 61. Banofsky's brother said that on his deathbed, he admitted to being the giant. It took his brother nearly 2 years to come to terms with his deathbed confession, and then he decided to go public. Several facts back up the idea that Banofsky was the giant. First off, he looked like some of the sketches of the giant, and he was tall and lanky. Secondly, during the second wave of attacks that happened in 1985, Banofsky was absent from his work at the Elst police station. The police in Elst set up roadblocks that the gang managed to avoid as they were making their getaway from their last robbery. Banofsky was absent from work because he had an injured foot. Witnesses who were in the grocery stores during the second wave of shootings said that one of the gang members walked with a limp. In the year after going public, Banofsky's brother was interviewed 3 times by the police. In the last interview, he admitted that Banofsky did not admit to being the giant. He said that his brother just said he was involved with the gang. Then in October 2018, the police said that they officially ruled out Banofsky as the giant. The only explanation they gave is that they compared his fingerprints to those that they had collected from the gang members, and they did not match. Banofsky's family was shocked by the news. They are sure he was involved in the gang because he admitted to it on his deathbed. They pointed out that when someone is on their deathbed, they do not make jokes about something like being involved in mass murders where children were killed. They said they weren't hoping that he was a killer, but by going public, it put a tremendous strain on their family. It wasn't something they would have done unless they were sure that Banofsky was involved in the gang. Banofsky's family gave the police his wristwatch, which should have his DNA on it. But the police have now compared the DNA on the wristwatch to the gang members' DNA, which they have samples of. Banofsky's family said that it is possible that there was more than one giant at different times, and Banofsky was one of them. The police have not made a comment on the possibility that the giant was multiple men. The police said they are continuing to investigate the crazy Brabant killers. In November 2015, the statute of limitations was going to run out on the last and worst massacre committed by the group. But then the court gave an extension of 10 years. The police and the people of Belgium are hoping by 2025, which will be the 40th anniversary of the worst mass murder, the members of the crazy Brabant killers will be identified and prosecuted. Number 3. Thomas Jones Jr. Larry Sherrard was born in May 1953 in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. He was one of 6 children. For most of his adult life, Sherrard worked as a plumber. But Sherrard also had a darker side, and he struggled with drugs for many years. In the summer of 2013, Sherrard's health took a turn for the worse. For the next 8 months, his niece, Pam Reinhardt, took care of him. As 2014 was beginning, Sherrard was nearing the end of his life. Then on February 1st, 2014, Sherrard told his niece that he had something important to tell her. He said that he did not want to go to hell. He then admitted that he had killed 2 men. He said that the first murder happened in 1988. He had shot a man in the head and then he rolled his body up in some carpet. He worked with an accomplice and they took the body to a saltpeter cave just outside the city, where they dumped the body. Sherrard then told his niece that a year after that murder, he shot another man. At the time, he was living in a house in Elizabethtown. He and 2 other men dug up the concrete in his basement. They dug a hole in the earth, and then they placed the body in it. Then they sprinkled lye or lime on the body. Finally, they laid new cement in the basement. Sherrard told Reinhardt that he murdered both men because something went wrong during separate drug deals. Sherrard did not share the names of his victims or his accomplices. Hours later, Sherrard slipped into a coma and he passed away on the morning of February 2nd, 2014. Pam Reinhardt said that because of the way her uncle looked at her when he confessed, she knew that the deathbed confession was most likely true. So after his funeral, Reinhardt went to the police. They looked into it, and one of the murders that was described was similar to a cold case that they had on file. In 1989, some spelunkers found the skeleton of a man in a saltpeter cave just outside of Elizabethtown. The skull had a bullet hole in it. Using dental records, the police identified the remains as 28-year-old Thomas Jones Jr. Jones was last seen alive over a year earlier on May 14, 1988. Jones had just gotten out of prison a month or 2 before he went missing. The police said that Pam Reinhardt knew things about Jones's murder that were not made public. This convinced them that her late uncle, Larry Sherrard, had been telling the truth on his deathbed. The police then went to the property where Sherrard said the second body was buried. The house where Sherrard had lived had been torn down, and a house for Habitat for Humanity was about to be constructed on the lot where it once stood. The construction was put on hold, and some archaeologists were brought to the lot. The lot was surveyed using ground-penetrating radar. The experts found 2 spots that they called disturbed locations. The property was excavated, and some bone fragments were found. The fragments were going to be tested to see if they were human or animal. But the results of the testing have not been made public. If Larry Sherrard did kill a man and buried him under his basement floor, he has never been identified. The police have said that they were going to look for Sherrard's accomplices. But in the 6 years since Sherrard died, no arrests have been made. At the time of this video, it's unknown if Sherrard killed 2 men, but it is believed that he is the man who killed Thomas Jones Jr. There was some speculation that Sherrard had not been in his right mind at the time of his death. But it turned out that his niece, Pam, was not the only one he confessed to. A year before his death, and while he was still healthy, Sherrard had told his brother and sister-in-law, who were Reinhardt's parents, that he had killed 2 men. His brother and sister-in-law were unsure what to do after he confessed to them. Then a few days after Sherrard confessed to them, his brother had a massive heart attack and died. While his brother was on his deathbed, he made his wife promise that she would take care of Sherrard. So she did not tell anyone that he had confessed to them. The police have said that the investigation into Larry Sherrard's death confession is ongoing. Number 2. Noreen Greenlee. At the end of the summer of 1963, Noreen Greenlee was 13 years old, and she lived with her parents and 6 siblings in the small town of Bowmanville, Ontario, Canada. At the time, Bowmanville had a population of just over 7,000 people. September 14th, 1963 was a Saturday. That night, Noreen went to the town's bowling alley with her best friend, Bonnie Wilkins, and Bonnie's boyfriend, Gary Woolner. After that, they went and got some food at a local diner. Then they went to Bonnie's house to hang out for a bit. Sometime between 11 and 11:30 p.m., Noreen left to catch the bus that ran on the town's main street. Around the same time that Noreen should have been riding the bus, her sister, Joyce, was walking with a friend. They were about a block from the Greenlee family's home. As they were walking, a car drove towards them and then had to swerve at the last minute to avoid them. Joyce and her friend thought that they heard a girl inside the car scream. When Joyce got home, she told her family that a car had nearly hit her. She told them it was a 1957 to 1959 blue Ford Prefect. Her father and her brother went out looking for the car, but they couldn't find it. After the excitement over the car had settled down, the Greenlees realized that Noreen had not come home. The police were alerted and the town was searched. But no trace of 13-year-old Noreen Greenlee could be found. The bus driver who was working that night was interviewed, and he told the police that Noreen had not gotten onto the bus. A person who lived near the bus stop told the police that they saw a girl matching Noreen's description get into a car sometime between 11 and 11:30 on the night that Noreen went missing. They said that the car was a 1957 to 1959 blue Ford Prefect. The witness said that they did not get a good look at the driver. They only saw that he was a white man and he was wearing a black fedora. Noreen's sister Joyce believes that the car that nearly hit her and her friend was the same one that Noreen got into. And the scream she heard was the scream of her sister. The police conducted a search for the car as well, but it was never found. A year after Noreen went missing, her parents received a tip that she was seen over 2,000 miles away in Calgary, Alberta. They traveled to Calgary to look for her, but they found no evidence that she was ever there. Weeks, months, and then years would go by, and no one saw or heard from Noreen. The police's leading theory was that Noreen knew her kidnapper. At the time of her disappearance, Noreen worked at a gas station in town. So it's possible that she met him there. Several years after Noreen went missing, her father had an aneurysm and he passed away. Noreen's mother turned to alcohol to deal with her pain. Her drinking got to be so bad that she ended up losing custody of her 3 youngest children. Decades would go by and no evidence emerged as to what happened to Noreen Greenlee. Then in 2016, nearly 53 years after Noreen vanished, an unidentified man got in contact with the Greenlee family. He told them that while his father was on his deathbed, he had confessed to killing a young girl. A lot of the details in his father's deathbed confession fit with Noreen's disappearance. The leading theory was that Noreen got into the car because she knew the driver. At the time of Noreen's disappearance, the man's father was the school bus driver in town, so Noreen probably knew who he was. The man also said that his father was a construction worker. His father supposedly told him that after he killed the girl, he placed her body in the trunk of the car and then buried the car in an area where a highway was being rerouted. Noreen's family also thought that this explanation fit with Noreen's disappearance. The car that the kidnapper drove had never been seen again. If it was buried with Noreen's body, that would explain why the car and her body had never been found. Noreen's family went to the police with the information from the deathbed confession, and the police interviewed the man. But they did not find the man credible, so they chose not to look into his father's supposed deathbed confession. The family then got in contact with the Cold Case Society, which is a group of people from different disciplines who analyze cold cases. A forensic anthropologist who works with the group, Renee Wilmot, went to the area where the man said the car should be buried. She did a magnetic scan and found an area of interest. In October 2018, the police finally agreed to conduct searches of the area. They dug out 2 long tracts of land. One hole was 150 feet long and 7 feet deep, while the second one was 100 feet long and it was also 7 feet deep. After the holes were dug, metal detectors were used. The police found nothing to indicate that a car had been buried in the area. As a result, they do not think it was a legitimate deathbed confession. The forensic anthropologist who did the magnetic scan of the area, Renee Wilmot, criticized the police's search of the area. She thinks that the police should have used ground-penetrating radar and searched a wider area. She thinks that the search of the area is incomplete. Noreen's family is hoping that one day they'll find her remains so that they can have a small measure of closure. Number 1. Nancy Marie Chomet and Michael Ann Ryan. June 15, 1955 was the last day of high school for students in Prince George County, Maryland. Nancy Marie Chomet was 16 years old and she attended Northwestern High School. Her friend, Michael Ann Ryan, was 14 and she had just finished grade school. Both girls were good students and they were popular. That morning, Nancy planned on picking up her report card from school and then she was going to head back home. Michael decided to join her. As they were walking in a park near some woods, someone opened fire on them. Nancy was shot 11 times, while Michael was shot 3 times. Their bodies were found about 2 hours after they left for school. The murder weapon was never found, but it's believed that it was a Marlin .22 caliber repeating rifle. It is thought that the killer was waiting for them in the woods. He was about 150 feet away when he started shooting. After the girls fell, he walked up to them and shot them some more. The rifle held 17 bullets, and the girls had been shot a combined 14 times. 3 more slugs were found in the area. This indicated that the killer was a skilled marksman. After he killed the 2 girls, he dragged their bodies into the woods and did a haphazard job of covering their bodies with twigs. The double murder rocked the people of Prince George County. Michael's father was a police officer in nearby Washington, D.C. Residents thought if a police officer's child could be murdered, how could the rest of their children be safe? the police of Prince George County started an around-the-clock investigation. Police from Washington, D.C. also helped. Then the FBI was brought in. In the days after the murders, the authorities brought a few people in for questioning, where they all had alibis, or the authorities were able to rule them out as suspects. The authorities were at a loss as to why someone would want to hurt the girls. They had not been sexually assaulted. Nancy's purse and the $2 inside of it were missing, but the authorities did not think that robbery was the motive behind the murders. Finally, both girls were well liked and neither had any known enemies. The police and the FBI interviewed 5,000 people and cleared over 200 suspects. Decades passed and no one was ever charged with the homicides. By January 1997, the case was hopelessly cold. It had been 41 and a half years since the girls were murdered in cold blood. On January 23, 1997, a 60-year-old woman called the police at Prince George County. She said her name was Jean Doback and she was calling from North Pole, Alaska. Jean said that 9 months earlier, she was in Hollywood, Florida. Her 57-year-old brother-in-law, Edward V. Doback, was on his deathbed. Jean had been married to Edward's younger brother, John. Supposedly, while Edward was on his deathbed, he confessed to shooting Nancy and Michael. She said that a few days before Edward killed them, Nancy and Michael had insulted him in some way. So he waited for them in the woods that morning and then shot them. The police decided to look into the details of what Jean had told them. At the time of the murders, Edward Doback was 17 years old. He and his family lived in Hyattsville, Maryland, which is about 3 miles from the crime scene. Edward attended Northwestern High School, which was the same high school that Nancy went to. Edward had never been considered a person of interest or a suspect in the case. In the case file, someone reported that Edward's 14-year-old brother, John, owned a gun that was similar to the one used in the murders. The anonymous tipster also described John as a gangster type. But neither the police nor the FBI investigated or questioned John or Edward. A year after the murders, the Doback family moved to Florida. Edward lived the rest of his life there. He had been married once and it lasted for 10 years, and he had 3 children. He worked for most of his life at the Seal Test ice cream plant. Edward died at the age of 57 on April 26, 1996, from liver cancer. His brother, John, married Jean, and they stayed married until John died 2 months after Edward died. What really convinced the police that Edward Doback had confessed to his sister-in-law, Jean Doback, was because Jean knew things about the crime that were never made public. On June 15, 2000, which was the 45th anniversary of the murders of Nancy Marie Chomet and Michael Ann Ryan, the police announced that based on his deathbed confession, they believed that Edward Doback was the killer. But they admitted that they couldn't prove anything that Jean had told them, but they could not disprove anything she said either. Then the Washington Post started looking into the case. They tried to talk to Jean Doback, but they couldn't locate her. They found her son, Ronald Doback, and he said he had not seen or heard from his mother in over a year. He said that the last contact he had with her was when he paid her bail and restitution in Alaska. She had just been convicted of insurance fraud. After Ronald paid her bail, she vanished. Ronald was asked about his uncle's deathbed confession. He said that his mother had told him about the confession and he believed it was true. His mother had told him that Edward confessed that he had flirted with the two girls, but one day they rejected him. So a few days later, he shot them to death. He said that his uncle was an angry man. Ronald also noted that his mother wasn't the most credible person. Ronald said that throughout his childhood, his parents, Jean and John, moved him from state to state so they could run insurance scams. The Washington Post also tracked down one of Edward's brothers who was still alive. Robert Dobek said that he didn't think that what Jean said made any sense. He claimed that Edward was the nicest guy you could ever meet, and there was no way he could have done anything like that. The police are confident that Edward Dobek is the killer, but since they have no definitive evidence, the case is not officially closed. Number 3. Sharon Phillips. In 1986, 20-year-old Sharon Phillips lived in Archerfield, a suburb of Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. She worked as a shop assistant. On the evening of May 8, 1986, Sharon finished work and then she went shopping with her friend. After their shopping trip, they went back to Sharon's flat for a bit and then she drove her friend home. Her friend lived in another suburb of Brisbane. Sharon departed from her friend's home at about 10:45 and she was heading home. At about 11 p.m., Sharon ran out of gas. She managed to get her car onto the shoulder of the road. Sharon was about 6 miles away from her home. She walked to an army barracks she had just driven by and she asked if she could use a phone. They would not allow her onto the property, so she left on foot. She found a phone booth at a convenience store that was a short distance away from where she ran out of gas. At 11:18 p.m., she called her boyfriend and asked him to pick her up. He left shortly after getting the phone call, but on the way, he got a flat tire. Sharon called him again at 12:03 from the same phone booth. His roommate told Sharon he had left to pick her up. Not long afterward, Sharon's boyfriend arrived in the area. He found her car parked and locked beside the road. Otherwise, he didn't see any trace of Sharon. He assumed that she had gotten another ride, so he went home. The next day, Sharon did not show up for work. Her employer ended up calling her parents. Her family started calling around to see if anyone had heard from her. One call they made was to Sharon's boyfriend. Sharon's boyfriend explained that he went to pick her up the night before after she ran out of gas, but he couldn't find her. Sharon's father went and picked up the car. He also got into her flat and looked for evidence for where she may be. At about 8 p.m., Sharon's parents reported her missing. The police conducted searches for Sharon. Unfortunately, a terrible rainstorm blew into the area the day after she was reported missing. This hampered the search efforts and it may have washed away some evidence. Nevertheless, the police searched for Sharon. Not long after Sharon went missing, her purse and her shoes were found in a drain not far from where her car had been abandoned. 5 days later, the search for Sharon ended without her being found dead or alive. Months became years, and years became decades, and still no trace of Sharon Phillips was found. Sharon's disappearance was incredibly difficult for her family. She had been close to her parents and her 8 siblings. Sharon was the third born. Sharon's mother, Dawn, became deeply depressed after her disappearance. Eventually, she started taking a lot of medication to deal with her depression. Dawn Phillips passed away in January 2010. Supposedly, before Dawn died, she said some things that cast suspicion on her husband and Sharon's father, Bob. She also supposedly wrote some things in her journal that seemed to indicate that Bob was responsible for Sharon's disappearance. The problem was that no one was really sure if Dawn was in her right mind or if the drugs were affecting her. In August 2015, Sharon's father, Bob, was in the hospital dying after a long illness. A detective who worked on the case for years came to the hospital. He directly asked him where Sharon was and what happened to her. The detective claims that Bob thought about it, but he never said anything. 75-year-old Bob Phillips died on August 23, 2015. Before Bob died, he had talked to a reporter, and he said that the police had never questioned him. In May 2016, the 3 eldest of the surviving Phillips children spoke to a reporter. They said that they thought that their father might have killed Sharon and hidden her body. They said that after Sharon ran out of gas, she may have called their father for help. He would have been incredibly angry that she made a mistake like that. He might have physically lashed out at her when he went to pick her up, and he killed her. The 3 siblings also said that they doubted their father's alibi for the night Sharon disappeared. Bob said that he and Dawn had driven to a town in New South Wales that is about 500 miles away from their home. They picked up a truck and drove back home. They arrived home at 4 or 5 in the morning and they went to bed. Bob said that when he woke up, he found out that Sharon was missing and he started searching for her. Bob's 3 children had come to doubt the story because he did get a truck at the time of Sharon's disappearance. He had previously owned a truck and used it for work, but he had stopped working and sold the truck years before Sharon went missing. When Sharon vanished, he was living off a pension and he wasn't working. Another problem with his alibi was that Dawn didn't drive. So who drove the car home after they picked up the truck? The siblings said that they wanted the police to search some bushland that was close to the home they were living in when Sharon went missing. The police agreed to search the bushland and excavations were done. But nothing of interest was found. A few weeks after the siblings talked to the reporter, a man named Ian Seeley got in contact with the police. Seeley told the police that his father, Raymond Peter Mulvihill, had been a taxi driver. He explained that sometimes his father was a good man. He coached soccer and he was a Boy Scout leader. He also dressed up as Santa Claus for kids at Christmas. Seeley said that his father also had a violent streak and he would become physically abusive to his family. In 1986, Seeley said he was 19 and his father was 37. At the time, his father drove a taxi that was stationed at the convenience store where Sharon made her last 2 phone calls. Seeley said that on the night of May 8, 1986, Seeley drove his car to the convenience store to pick up his father. Seeley said when he got there, he discovered his father was drunk and he was acting oddly. Seeley said that his father told him to keep an eye out for police officers. His father got into the driver's seat of his car and then drove to the back of the store where the taxi was parked. Seeley said that while his father was behind the store, a police officer pulled up to him and asked him what he was doing. While he was talking to the police officer, he heard 2 car trunks close. Seeley said that after the police officer drove away, his father drove his car out from behind the store. Seeley got into the passenger seat and his father started driving. Seeley heard loud thumping in the trunk, but he wasn't sure what it was, so he asked his father. His father ignored him and turned up the radio. When they arrived home, Seeley said his father instructed him to get out of the car. He did as he was told, and his father drove off. His father returned the next morning with scratches on his face, and he gave him his car back. Seeley said that a few days later, he opened the trunk of the car and he found a pair of women's shoes and a purse. He told his father about the items and he freaked out. He said that he believed his father got rid of the purse and shoes because he never saw them again. Seeley said that in 2002, his father was dying in the hospital and he went to see him. His father told him that on that night, he had Sharon Phillips in the trunk of the car. He had come back to the convenience store and she was out in front. She explained that she had run out of gas and she asked him, as a taxi driver, to drive her home. Instead, he kidnapped her and put her in the trunk of the taxi. He then moved her into the trunk of Seeley's car. His father said he dumped Sharon's body in a drain in an industrial park not far from their home. Not long after confessing, his father died. Seeley claimed that he had called Crime Stoppers 6 times since his father's death, but no one ever followed up on the information. After he saw the news story where 3 of Sharon's siblings blamed their father for the murder, he decided to go directly to the police. The police investigated Ian Seeley's story and it held up for the most part. However, they were unable to find Sharon's remains. Nevertheless, the police said that they were confident that Raymond Mulvihill kidnapped and killed Sharon Phillips. If he had not been dead for 14 years, they would have charged him with her murder. The police also said they officially cleared Bob Phillips as a suspect in his daughter's disappearance. Upon further investigation, they also found out where Bob was on the night Sharon disappeared. Sadly, the remains of Sharon Phillips have never been found. But the police have said that after 30 years, the case is closed. Since talking to the police, Ian Seeley has made further allegations about his father, Raymond Mulvihill. He claims his father was a prolific serial rapist and killer. He said that his father would break into women's homes and kill them. Or he would kill anyone who crossed him, like someone who supposedly stole money from the soccer club where he was a coach. Seeley also claims that his father performed contract hits for an Australian crime family. His criminal nickname was supposedly the Gingerbread Man. The police said they have found no evidence that Mulvihill committed any of these other murders. They have not even acknowledged that the crimes Seeley said his father committed ever happened. Nevertheless, Ian Seeley maintains that his father, Raymond Mulvihill, was a notorious killer with an untold body count. Number 2. Russell Bean. At the end of the summer in 1978, Russell Bean was 26 years old. He lived in the small town of Marlow, New Hampshire. At the time, only about 390 people lived in the town. Russell was a hard worker who loved the outdoors. He was married to a woman named Sylvia, and they had 3 children together. On the night of September 15th, 1978, Russell went out, and he didn't return home. He was reported missing, and there was a short investigation. The police concluded that Russell had abandoned his family and moved away from the area. His family did their best to move on without him. About a year after Russell disappeared, Sylvia married one of Russell's best friends, Robert Chambers. Before Russell went missing, he and Robert would hang out several times a week. They'd often drink beer and play pool together. Robert had a large rural property in Marlow that was isolated. After Sylvia married Robert, she and her 3 children moved onto the property. In 1885, Robert Chambers became the chief of police in Marlow. Since the town was so small, it was only a part-time job. On March 9, 1988, Robert's father, 61-year-old Clifton Chambers, was in the hospital. He was on his deathbed. As he lay dying, he talked to his daughter, Melissa Chambers, and his close friend. He told them that on September 15, 1978, his son, Robert, came to his house. Robert told him that he and Russell had gotten into a fist fight. Russell had hit his head on a rock, and he died. Clifton said that he helped Robert hide Russell's body. They had rented a backhoe and dug a 20-foot hole in Robert's front yard. They placed 26-year-old Russell Bean's body in the hole, and they covered it up with dirt. Clifton died a short time after making the deathbed confession. The next day, Clifton's daughter and his friend went to the police and they gave sworn statements. The day after that, the police got a search warrant and they started digging in Robert's front yard. Russell Bean's former wife and his 3 children had lived in the house for the past 10 years. After 3 days of digging, the police found a set of human remains. Using dental records, the remains were identified as 26-year-old Russell Bean. The medical examiner said that the cause of death was blows to the head and chest with an unknown instrument. A month after the remains were found, on April 15, 1988, 36-year-old Robert Chambers was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. A month after that, a grand jury hearing was held. The details were often lurid. Supposedly, Russell and Robert had been involved with wife swapping. Robert had been married to a woman named Deborah Wentworth. Deborah testified at the grand jury. Deborah said that she and Robert had separated in July 1978, about 2 months before Russell was killed. On the night of September 15, 1978, she hitchhiked to Robert's home. When she got there, no one was home. Then Robert and Russell showed up. Robert was mad and started swearing at her and calling her names. Russell stuck up for her and Robert pushed him towards her, saying he could have her. Deborah testified that she and Robert continued to argue and Russell stepped in between them. Suddenly, Robert attacked Russell with a hatchet. He hit him multiple times in the head and once in the chest. Deborah said that afterward, Robert forced her to get into his vehicle and he drove her out to a nearby pond. At the pond, he beat her up and threatened her. He left her by the pond, he got into his vehicle, and he drove away. In the end, the grand jury chose not to indict Robert Chambers because they did not feel that there was enough evidence to charge him with second-degree murder. As a result, all the charges against him were dropped. After Russell's body was found, Sylvia filed for divorce. In June, a month after the grand jury hearing, Robert Chambers resigned as the chief of police. He has only ever made one public statement about the murder. He said, "I did not kill Russ Bean." In July 2016, 28 years after the grand jury hearing, 64-year-old Robert Chambers was arrested again. This time, it was for sexually abusing a young girl. The abuse happened between April 1994 and March 2001. The abuse began when the girl was just 7 years old. Robert Chambers went to trial in July 2017, a year after he was arrested. He was convicted on 4 counts of aggravated felonious sexual assault. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The earliest he can be released is 2027. The murder of Russell Bean is considered an open case. Russell's brother and sister still hope that one day the case will be closed. Many people believe that Robert Chambers killed Russell Bean. Other people think that another citizen in the small town, possibly someone who has lived amongst them for decades, is the killer. Unless someone comes forward with new information or new evidence is found, the case will probably never be resolved. Number 1. Kathleen Krausneck. James Krausneck and Kathleen Schlosser both grew up in Mount Clemens, Michigan. They attended the same high school, and they both ended up going to Western Michigan University. While they were at university, they started dating. In May 1974, the couple wed and they moved to Fort Collins, Colorado, where James started working on his PhD in economics. In the summer of 1978, they welcomed a daughter named Sarah. A year later, James got a job as an assistant professor of economics at Liberal Arts College in Lynchburg, Virginia. For a few months, Kathleen worked as a counselor for teens and adults with disabilities. But she ultimately decided to leave her job so she could focus on raising Sarah. In the summer of 1981, James got a job as an economist at Eastman Kodak, so he and his family moved to Bryan, New York. Bryan is an upper middle class town that had a population of around 35,000 people. It's just south of Rochester, New York. It's a quiet town, and at the time, it was known for its excellent school system. Unfortunately, Kathleen wasn't happy in Brighton. She was lonely and missed her family and friends who lived in Michigan. She had talked to several people about moving back to Michigan. In January 1982, one of Kathleen's uncles died, and she had to explain death to her daughter Sarah, who was just 3.5 years old. Kathleen thought that Sarah understood as well as a child her age could understand something as significant as the finality of death. A month later, on the evening of February 19, 1982, James called the police, and officers arrived at the family's home minutes later. James explained that morning he left for work sometime between 6:30 and 7 a.m. He returned home just before 5 p.m. that evening, and he found that the house was unusually quiet. He went upstairs to the master bedroom, and he found his 29-year-old wife, Kathleen, in bed. There was an axe embedded in the side of her head. James said he ran to his daughter Sarah's room and found her in bed as well. She was asleep and unharmed. He picked her up and ran to a neighbor's home where he called 911. The neighbor said that James's face had no color and he couldn't stop looking at the house. She said that there was a look of terror on his face. The medical examiner concluded that Kathleen had been killed with a single axe blow to the head. The blade went about 3.5 inches into her head. She had no defensive wounds, and she was still wearing her nightgown. There were no signs she had been sexually assaulted. The police concluded that she was probably hacked in the head with the axe while she was sleeping. The time of death was sometime between 11 p.m. the night before she was found and 3:30 on the day James called 911. The axe was one of 2 axes that the family owned, which they used to chop firewood. It is believed that the killer got the axe from the family's garage. The garage had not been broken into, and it's thought that the garage had been left unlocked. In the garage, the killer also picked up a maul, which is a tool used to split wood. The killer wore a sock on his or her hand, and using the maul, he or she smashed a window in the door to an enclosed patio that was off the kitchen. After smashing the window, the killer dropped the maul near the patio door. The police checked the house for prints, but they didn't find a single fingerprint in the house. They didn't even find any of the family members' fingerprints. The lead detective said it was like no one lived there. At first, the police thought that Kathleen might have been killed in the commission of a house robbery. Silverware in a sack was found on the dining room floor, which was on the main floor of the house. But the police noticed some glaring problems with that theory. For example, why would a burglar first go into the garage and pick up a weapon like a 2.5-foot axe? If it was a burglar and he or she thought someone was inside the house, why would they choose to rob the Krausnick's house? Why wouldn't he or she just pick a different house where no one was home? If the killer intended to break into a house, when they had brought a tool with them to help them break in, instead of relying on finding a tool at the victim's house? Also, why would a burglar use 2 tools during the crime? Why did he or she use the maul to break the window on the patio door instead of just using the axe to break the window? If the burglar thought that someone was in the house and they needed to arm themselves with an axe, why did he or she break into the house by smashing a window? Why not find a quieter way to get into the house to avoid arousing suspicion? Also, if it was a robbery, why would the burglar walk upstairs and kill Kathleen while she was sleeping in her bed, instead of just taking what he or she wanted and getting out of the house? The most significant problem with the robbery theory is that nothing was stolen from the house. Why would the perpetrator go to the trouble to sneak into Kathleen's room, kill her while she slept, and take nothing with him or her when they left? It wasn't like the killer panicked and got out of the house quickly. He or she stayed in the house and meticulously wiped down every surface to the point where the police couldn't find a single fingerprint. It seems odd that he or she would be so careful and meticulous about cleaning up and then forget to steal anything. For these reasons, the police think that the house was set up to look like there had been a robbery. The police thought that this explained why the axe and the maul was used. Kathleen was killed before the window was broken, so the killer couldn't move the axe without leaving a blood trail. After Kathleen was dead, the killer got the maul and smashed the back window to make it look like there had been a break-in. The problem was that if robbery wasn't the motive, then the police had no idea who would want to kill the 29-year-old homemaker who had only lived in the area for 6 months. Because the motive wasn't clear, the police were hoping that James would cooperate with the investigation. Specifically, they wanted to interview his daughter Sarah, who was at home when her mother was killed, and she was inside the house with her body all day. Instead, the day after Kathleen was found murdered, James went to Michigan and he took Sarah with him. James did agree to talk to the police, but only with his lawyer present, and he refused to let them speak to Sarah. James told the police that Kathleen was alive when he left for work, and when he came home, he found her dead. He also said that he and Kathleen had a good marriage and they were happy. Many people who knew the couple, including Kathleen's family, said it seemed like they had a good marriage and they both loved each other deeply. But after some investigating, the police learned that their marriage wasn't perfect. It turned out that James was having problems at work. When he applied for his job at Eastman Kodak, he told them he had a PhD. After he was hired, Kodak checked his credentials and they discovered that he had never actually finished his doctorate. It's not known if James was in danger of losing his job. What is known is that Kathleen did learn that for years he had been lying about getting his PhD. There were also some rumors that James was abusive, but the police were not able to confirm this. No physical evidence tied James to the murder, so he wasn't charged, but he remained a person of interest. After the murder, James and Sarah moved to St. Clair, Michigan, and then they moved to Gig Harbor, Washington. In the 38 years after Kathleen's murder, James got married 3 more times. In 2012, a man named Edward Larrabee was dying of ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. At the time, he was serving a life sentence in prison in New York State. Larrabee had a long history of violence against women. In the fall of 1974, Larrabee, who was 20, was sentenced to 6.5 years to 25 years in prison. Larrabee had pleaded guilty to raping a 15-year-old girl at knife point in October 1973. He had also been charged with raping a 17-year-old girl a month later. But since he pleaded guilty to the first charge, the charges for the second assault were dropped. Larrabee was released from prison in May 1980. He was arrested again 2 months later for a sex crime. He pleaded guilty, and in April 1981, he was sentenced to 5.5 years to 7 years of prison. Due to time served and a technicality, he was released from prison in May 1981. In February 1982, Kathleen Krausneck was murdered. Larrabee was on parole at the time, and he didn't live far from the Krausnecks' home. A detective tried to interview Larrabee a couple weeks after Kathleen's murder. Larrabee told the detective to get out, and he said, "I'm not talking to any pigs." In October 1994, a man wearing a Halloween mask, armed with a knife, robbed 5 women within 2 hours along a path in Brighton. Some of the women's money and items were stolen, but none of the women were injured. A detective who knew Larrabee thought he might have been responsible for the robberies. Larrabee was arrested and he pleaded guilty to robbery charges. He was sentenced to 4 to 8 years of prison. In the summer of 1991, Larrabee was out of prison and he was living in Greece, New York. He was the maintenance man at an apartment building. On July 31st, 1991, a resident of the apartment building, 27-year-old Stephanie Kopczynski, went missing. Kopczynski was an elementary school music teacher. In the summer, she gave violin lessons. Edward Larrabee was the prime suspect in her disappearance. But the police couldn't find any evidence that Kopczynski was dead, let alone that Larrabee killed her. Police decided to surveil Larrabee. On August 14, 1992, 41-year-old Edward Larrabee was caught attacking a 16-year-old girl who was walking alone. Larrabee was convicted of first-degree sexual abuse and attempted third-degree assault. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. In April 1998, some boys were catching fish in a stream outside of Holly, New York. They found some human remains. Using dental records, it was determined that they were the remains of Stephanie Kopczynski. She had been missing for 7 years. Her remains were found just a few miles from her home. The FBI could not determine the cause of death. Edward Larrabee was still the prime suspect, but the discovery of the body did not yield any new physical evidence to charge Larrabee with the murder. In July 2001, Larrabee, who was still serving his sentence, was in a private hospital because he had a heart condition. He attacked the correctional officer who was guarding him and strangled him with wires from a monitor. Hospital security subdued Larrabee and he was sent back to prison. In April 2002, Larrabee was found guilty of attempted murder and he was given another life sentence. In July 2012, Larrabee was suffering from ALS. He knew that he was dying, so he started talking to detectives. He told them he wanted to die and be buried outside of the prison system. In exchange, he would confess to the murder of Stephanie Kopczynski. The detectives arranged for him to be buried off the prison grounds, but he'd have to die in prison. In July 2012, Larrabee confessed to strangling Kopczynski. Larrabee was charged with second-degree murder, and even though he had confessed, he pleaded not guilty. Because of Larrabee's failing health, there was no definitive plans to go to trial. In 2012, Larrabee wrote a letter to the newspaper, the Democrat and Chronicle. He wrote, "I am what psychiatrists call a sociopath. I can assure you, for better or worse, that I am not burdened by morality, ethics, or remorse, and I certainly do not possess a conscience that needs to be cleansed." Edward Larrabee died in the prison's hospice on May 4, 2014. He was 60 years old. It turned out that Larrabee confessed to another murder on his deathbed. He claimed he killed Kathleen Krausneck. When Kathleen was killed, Larrabee lived close by, and an officer had attempted to question him about her murder a couple weeks after it happened. Larrabee refused to answer any questions, and he kicked the detective out of his home. But there were a few problems with Larrabee's deathbed confession. He said he murdered Kathleen in 1983 when she was actually killed in 1982. He also said that Kathleen had short dark hair, but she had long blonde hair. He claimed that he sexually assaulted Kathleen and then hit her in the head with the axe while she was on her knees. But Kathleen had not been sexually assaulted and she was killed while she was lying in bed. She was most likely asleep when she was murdered. Because of the inconsistencies in the deathbed confession, the police do not think that Larrabee killed Kathleen. They think he was lying because he wanted to make it look like he had information about unsolved crimes. He hoped that by promising new information about unsolved crimes, it would get him moved to a hospice outside the prison. So the police did not go public with the deathbed confession. In 2016, the FBI got involved in the investigation of Kathleen Krausneck's murder, and they were going to have some evidence tested for DNA. But no DNA was found on the evidence. In November 2019, the police made an arrest in the case. They arrested Kathleen's former husband, 67-year-old James Krausneck, and charged him with second-degree murder. The police said they arrested James 37 years after the murder because they had examined the timeline he gave them and they found holes in it. They also said that no singular piece of evidence led to his arrest. In January 2020, James's lawyer announced that they had learned that Edward Larrabee had confessed to the murder. He He said it made more sense that Larrabee killed Kathleen than if James killed Kathleen. James did not have a criminal record. On the other hand, Larrabee had a history of violence towards women and is strongly believed that he murdered at least one woman. Larrabee also confessed to killing Kathleen. James's lawyer asked for documents regarding Larrabee's crimes to be unsealed. James Krausneck was scheduled to go to trial at the end of 2020. However, the COVID-19 pandemic may cause a delay. At the time of this video, James lives in Arizona, and up until October 2020, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has restricted travelers from Arizona from coming into the state. So James has not been able to attend any of his court dates. At the time of this video, it's unclear when James Krausneck will go to trial for the murder of his wife, Kathleen Krausneck. When he does go to trial, his defense lawyer plans on presenting Edward Larrabee as an alternate suspect. Oddly enough, Kathleen Krausneck was not the only person to die an unnatural death in that house. 5 years before the Krausnecks moved in, 69-year-old Anthony Schiaffino and his 70-year-old wife, Estelle, lived in the house. On the night of April 11, 1977, Estelle parked her car in the garage and closed the garage door. Unfortunately, she forgot to turn the car off. Anthony and Estelle went to bed that night while the car was still running. Their son found their dead bodies 2 days later. They had died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Since there were 3 tragic deaths in less than 6 years in the house, some people believe that the house is cursed. When the house goes up for sale, it often sits on the market for months, and when it does sell, it usually goes for under market value. Number 3. Richard Bouillon. Ile St. John is a small diamond-shaped island in the Thousand Island River in Quebec, Canada. The island is about 18 miles north of downtown Montreal. The island is a little less than a half a mile wide and less than half a mile long. In the fall of 1999, it was home to 16-year-old Julie Superanna and her father. Julie had 3 siblings and 7 nieces and nephews. On the night of November 16, 1999, Julie took the city bus. At 9:55 p.m., she got off the bus at a stop that was about 65 yards from the apartment she shared with her father. Sadly, Julie never made it home. A massive search was conducted. 12 dogs were used, and 200 volunteers came out to look for the 16-year-old. But not a single clue to Julie's whereabouts was found. The police talked to some passengers who were on the bus and the bus driver. The bus driver said that a man was waiting at the bus stop when Julie got off, and he asked the man if he wanted to board. The man made a motion saying that he didn't. The bus driver said it was a white man who was wearing dark, baggy clothes. A passenger was hypnotized, and he said that the man was about 5'7" and he had dark eyes. He was wearing baggy, light-colored pants and a dark jacket that had a hood. He was wearing a hat that may have had a New York Yankees logo on it. He was also wearing a bandana on the bottom part of his face. He may have had a scar over one of his eyes. The witness also saw a second man near the bus shelter. He was wearing a white hat and a dark coat with a white Nike swoosh on the back of it. Another witness, who wasn't on the bus but was in the area, said that he saw a young woman with dark curly hair talking to 2 men beside a car. The car was beige, and it was possibly a Honda Civic or a Ford Tempo. The police believe that these 2 men were the same men the bus passenger saw. The police wanted to talk to the men, but they couldn't find them. Eventually, the police developed a suspect. It was a 45-year-old man named Richard Billig. He lived in the apartment above Julie and her father. Billig had a criminal record that involved sex crimes. In 1990, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison after he raped a teenage girl in the hospital when he posed as a doctor. In March 2001, about a year and a half after Julie's disappearance, Richard Billig was arrested. But he was not arrested in connection with Julie's disappearance. Instead, he was arrested on 16 counts of rape. He had been accused of raping his girlfriend's daughter between 1973 and 1989. The girl was 5 when the abuse started and 16 when it ended. She said that Billig would drug her so she couldn't fight back. The abuse only came to an end when he was arrested for raping the teenage girl in the hospital. 2 other women came forward and said that Billig had also drugged and sexually abused them as children. Billig went to trial in November 2001. A psychiatrist revealed that Billig had boasted about his sex crimes. Billig had claimed he had raped 15 women by the time he was 15 years old. He said that by the time he was 20, he had sexually assaulted 30 more women. The police thought that these numbers were inflated, but they still found a disturbing number of victims. They thought he had sexually assaulted 15 girls and women. A psychiatrist said that Billig was a remorseless psychopath, a manipulator, and a narcissist obsessed with sex. Billig had learned nothing from his decades of treatment. Richard Billig was convicted on all counts. The prosecution wanted him labeled as a dangerous offender so he'd be sentenced to life without the chance of parole. Instead, he was sentenced to just 6 years and 5 months in prison with 10 years of probation. His victims were outraged, and they said he would go back to sexually assaulting women as soon as he was released. But it turned out that he would never get that opportunity. While in prison, Billig was diagnosed with cancer. In June 2006, he was dying in a hospital. The police visited him several times in the hospital, and they asked him several times what happened to Julie. But he maintained they had nothing to do with the 16-year-old's disappearance. While Billig wasn't forthcoming with the police, he was with 2 healthcare workers. He apparently looked into the eyes of the coroner, Catherine Rudel-Tessier, and said, "I killed her." Rudel-Tessier asked him who he killed, and he said, "Julie." Over 3 days, Billig told an auxiliary nurse, Annick Prudhomme, about the murder. He said he had sexually assaulted her and strangled her. On day 3, he told her that he put her body in a gym bag and put bricks into the gym bag. He then dumped the bag in the river that surrounded the island. He said that the body went into the water across from a church. On June 22, 2006, 52-year-old Richard Billig died from cancer. Catherine Rudel-Tessier and Annick Prudhomme, the 2 healthcare workers whom Billig made the deathbed confessions to, talked with each other after he died. Prudhomme said that Billig planned on confessing to a popular crime reporter. Prudhomme assumed that he had before he died. So they didn't feel the need to tell their supervisors, let alone the police, about Billig's deathbed confessions. Nearly 5 years went by, and then, in January 2011, Annick Prudhomme was watching the news. She saw a report about Julie's murder from the crime reporter that Bouillon wanted to confess to. The reporter said that Julie's murder was still unsolved, so she realized that Bouillon had not contacted him before he died. She called the reporter's tip line and told him about Bouillon's deathbed confessions. Prudhomme then told the story about the deathbed confessions live on air. The police were upset that she didn't tell them right away about the deathbed confessions. They said they would have had her wear a wire, or they would have put a mic in the room had they known he was confessing. In September 2011, 12 years after the disappearance, the police searched the river where Bouillon said he dumped Julie's body. But no trace of Julie was found. Nevertheless, that year, Julie Supernaud was pronounced dead. In October 2012, nearly 13 years after Julie's disappearance, the coroner released a report. The report said that she was most likely killed by Richard Bouillon and her body was dumped into the river. Tragically, no trace of Julie Supernaud has ever been found. Number 2. Emma Stillwell. In November 1882, a 30-year-old woman named Emma Stillwell arrived at the home of her father-in-law in Waterford, Connecticut. Emma had her 9-month-old child with her. Emma was deathly ill with consumption. A few weeks later, she still wasn't better, so her husband, Jay Stillwell, was called for. Jay was a freight conductor, and he lived with Emma and their child in Ottumwa, Iowa. Jay arrived at his father's home on December 7, 1882. 4 days later, Emma told her husband that she had some horrible things to get off her chest before she died. Emma explained that she first got married when she was 15 years old to a man named Benjamin Swigart. They lived in Maryville, Missouri. Emma had 2 children who were now 8 and 6 years old. Benjamin was a shoemaker who accumulated a lot of wealth. He owned 2 houses and 8 lots. Benjamin was an alcoholic who often came home drunk. Emma said that she and her brother, Chester Horde, and her mother, Susan Snyder, decided to kill Benjamin. On March 3, 1987, Benjamin came home and he was drunk. Chester threw Benjamin face down on the floor. Emma said that she struck her husband on the back of the head with a shoemaker's hammer. Then they put him into bed. Emma said that she took her 2 kids over to her neighbor's home and spent the night. The next day, Benjamin's body was discovered. Emma, Chester, and their mother were all arrested, but they were released after the coroner's jury determined that Benjamin had died after he choked to death on his own vomit because he was intoxicated. Unfortunately, this was just the start of Emma's deathbed confession. Emma said that she, her mother, and her brother continued to live in Benjamin's house and they took on boarders. They learned that one of the boarders had money, so they got into his room and beat him to death with a hammer. But they learned that he didn't have much money on him. They dumped his body in a ravine outside of the town. The body was found a year later, and by that time, it was horribly decomposed. The body was never identified, and Emma said she didn't know who he was. Emma then got to the part of her life that her husband knew about. They got married in January 1878 and settled in Rouleau, Nebraska. Around their first anniversary, Emma gave birth to a daughter named Gertie. On May 11, 1880, Gertie was 14 months old. Emma said that she didn't like Gertie because she was puny and sickly. Emma claimed that her mother made a tea from steeped peach leaves. They had Gertie drink the tea. After that, Emma said she strangled 14-month-old Gertie to death. Jay was at work at the time, and when he got home, he was told that Gertie had died a natural death. In March 1881, Emma and Jay moved to Ottumwa, Iowa. Shortly after that, Emma's mother, Susan Snyder, was traveling to visit them, and she was involved in a railroad accident. Susan died 4 months later. Emma gave birth to another child in early 1882. If what Emma said wasn't shocking enough, she then told her husband that she had tried to kill him 3 different times to get his insurance money. After hearing the confessions to the 3 murders and his own attempted murder, Jay Stillwell didn't tell anyone about them for several days. Then he got the minister, the justice of the peace, and 2 other respected members of the community. Emma confessed to them as well and signed the confession. On January 2, 1883, the town's physician, who was also the minister, spent the day with Emma. She told him that she had committed other horrible crimes that she would never confess to. The minister/doctor convinced her to unburden her soul. So Emma did. She said that after her mother's accident, she nursed her for several months. But then she became tired of taking care of her mother, so she killed her as well. She strangled her to death while her husband was out of the house. The minister/doctor asked what disease her father had died from. Emma started sobbing and then blurted out that he had died of a slit throat. Emma's father, Chester Hort Sr., disappeared in 1852, the same year that Emma was born. The family told people that Chester Sr. went to California and he was killed during a gold mine dispute. Emma never explained who slit his throat or how she knew he died of a slit throat. After Emma confessed, her brother, Chester, was confronted. He denied having anything to do with the murders. Several doctors examined Emma, and while she was physically ill, they thought she was mentally sound. So they had no reason to doubt her deathbed confessions. The deathbed confessions made headlines throughout the country. This prompted several people to get in touch with the police. This included a Catholic priest who claimed he was with Charles Hort Sr. when he died, and he said that he did not die of a slit throat. Another person who contacted the police was a member of the coroner's jury who ruled on Benjamin Sweegart's death. They said that Benjamin's body showed no signs of trauma, and they had ruled he had drowned on his own vomit. Emma Stillwell died on January 16, 1883, at the age of 30. To many people, it's unclear if she murdered the 4 people she confessed to killing. Since there was so much confusion and a lack of evidence, Emma's brother, Charles Hort Jr., was never charged with any crimes in connection with the deathbed confessions. Number 1. Leo Sylvester Hannon. In August 1942, 62-year-old Annie Smith and her 74-year-old sister, Rosalind Smith, lived in the Salvation Army headquarters in Wairoa, New Zealand. Wairoa is a town on New Zealand's Northern Island. Annie was a brigadier with the Salvation Army. For 25 years, she did missionary work in Japan. She had only come back to her native New Zealand 2 years earlier. On August 21, 1942, a neighbor of the sisters made a horrifying discovery. They found Annie dead in a chair in the headquarters. It was clear she had died from severe head injuries. Also, she had been dead for quite some time. In a bedroom was the dead body of Rosalind Smith. Like her sister, she had died from terrible head injuries. The medical examiner believed that Annie had been killed with an axe, while Rosalind was killed with an axe and a fire poker. The medical examiner thought that the sisters were killed nearly 2 weeks earlier, on August 8th. After they were killed, but before their bodies were found, at least 2 people entered the Salvation Army headquarters. One was a woman who came in through the kitchen and went to the hall to pray. After praying, she left. She didn't see either body. The other person was an 8-year-old girl. She got into the headquarters while she was playing with some friends. She threw some pillows at the window and they threw them back to her. She saw Annie's body, but she didn't tell anyone because she was too scared. The police noted that the women's pants were pulled down, but there were no signs of sexual assault. Also, nothing appeared to have been stolen. Money was found in the possession of both women, so the police were at a loss to the motive. The police investigated the double homicide, but no suspects were arrested. It wasn't long before the case went cold. About 6 years later, there was another axe murder in Wairoa. In December 1948, 69-year-old William Henry Brunton lived alone in a hut near the railway station in Wairoa. Brunton was a retired railway guard. On December 18, 1948, a neighbor found his dead body propped up against his bed. He had been struck at least 6 times in the head with an axe. The police were baffled by the murder. It appeared that nothing had been stolen. Also, Brunton was a quiet man who kept to himself. He did not have any enemies, so the police had no idea who killed him. The police found a bloody fingerprint on the back door of his hut. They collected fingerprints from 5,000 people, but they never found a match. For decades, both cases sat cold. Then, over 33 years later, in 1982, a lawyer and author named George Israel Joseph published a book about unsolved crimes in New Zealand entitled By Person or Persons Unknown. In the book, Joseph wrote about visiting a convicted murderer in July 1962. He did not reveal the identity of the man, only calling him X. Joseph had defended X when he was convicted of murder. When Joseph visited X in prison, X was dying of cancer. X told Joseph that he had done some horrible things in his life that the police weren't aware of. He then admitted to killing the Smith sisters in the Salvation Army headquarters. X said that he was working on a farm about 20 miles away from the Salvation Army headquarters. On Saturdays, he would go drinking at a pub. He said that Annie would come into the pub and tell them that they were going to hell and that they should quit drinking. X said that they would all laugh at her whenever she came in. X then explained that one of the men he drank with said that Annie and her sister had a lot of money. X decided to see if that was true, and he went over to the Salvation Army headquarters. He ended up killing the 2 women, but he didn't find any money. Joseph asked X why he pulled their pants down. He explained that he wanted to make it look like a sex crime. X had a criminal record, but it wasn't for sex crimes. He thought that by making it look like a sex crime, it would completely throw suspicion away from him. Then Joseph asked X if he killed Herbert William Brunton as well. X admitted he did. He thought that Brunton might have had money, but he didn't. The only thing he ended up stealing was a half-empty bottle of gin. Sometime after Joseph's book was published, a police officer named Sherwood Young read the book. He then contacted Joseph and asked for the identity of X. Joseph said it was a man named Leo Sylvester Hannon. Hannon was born in October 1900 in Wellington, New Zealand. As an adult, Hannon worked as a laborer and bushman. In 1926, he was in prison on unspecified charges and he managed to escape. But he was caught a short time later. In 1931, he was arrested for breaking and entering and he was sentenced to 18 months of hard labor. In 1940, Hannon was arrested on 6 counts of breaking and entering. He went to trial the following year and he was convicted. In February 1941, he was sentenced to 18 months of hard labor. In August 1942, he murdered the Smith sisters. 6 years later, he killed Herbert William Brunton. 2 years after that, on August 10, 1950, Frederick Andrew Stade, a 54-year-old night watchman at the railway station in Wellington, was murdered at the station. He had been beaten to death with an iron pipe. Minutes before Stade's body was found, he was seen arguing with a man. The man wanted to use the staff washroom, and Stade would not allow him to use the facilities. Several people gave a description of the man. About 3 hours later, the police came across 50-year-old Leo Sylvester Hannon, who looked a lot like the description of the man. He had blood splattered on his face, his left hand, and his shoes. He also had a small piece of human flesh on the right cuff of his pants. In November 1950, Hannon was convicted of murdering Stade. He was sentenced to life in prison. In 1955, Hannon was working in a prison quarry. He managed to slip away without anyone noticing. He was recaptured a short time later. Hannon died in prison of cancer in October 1962 at the age of 62. Of course, that wasn't before he confessed on his deathbed to murdering the Smith sisters and Herbert William Brunton. After Sherwood Young learned that Hannon was X in George Israel Joseph's book, he looked at Hannon's record. He learned that Hannon was not in prison or doing hard labor when the murders were committed. So he is confident that Hannon was telling the truth on his deathbed. George Israel Joseph died in 1989. Young did not reveal the identity of X until 2000 when he wrote a biographical article on Annie Smith. With 4 murders committed between 1942 and 1950, Leo Sylvester Hannon is considered New Zealand's first serial killer. Number 3. Jesse Aylward. In early 1984, 59-year-old Virginia Hannon lived in the small town of Pembroke, Massachusetts. She had been a widow since 1971 when her husband, Joseph, died. They had no children. But Virginia, who went by Ginny, would bake treats for children in the neighborhood. She would also feed stray dogs and cats. She had worked as a cook in the cafeteria at the local school. Then, sometime in the early 1980s, her aunt died and left her $380,000. After getting the inheritance, she retired. Despite her newfound wealth, she continued to live modestly. She lived in the same house and drove her old beat-up car. Ginny liked to play bingo and loved family cookouts. One problem that Ginny had was that she was too open. She would often tell people personal information after only knowing them for a short while. So many people knew that she had gotten the inheritance. On Saturday, February 11th, 1984, Ginny and her friend went to a 5 o'clock church service. Afterward, they went out for dinner. Then, around 7:30 p.m., Ginny's friend dropped her off at home. Going to church and a restaurant for dinner with her friend was a typical Saturday for Ginny. 2 days later, the dead body of 59-year-old Ginny Hannon was found in her bed. Her death had been brutal. It appeared that she had been kicked in the stomach hard enough to leave a bruise. She had been stabbed 6 times in the abdomen and once in the left eye. The cause of death was strangulation with a pair of nylon stockings. There were no signs of sexual assault. It's believed that the motive was robbery. There were rumors around the neighborhood that Ginny kept the money from her inheritance hidden in her house. The killer may have tortured her to get her to reveal the location of her money. The police interviewed over 100 people, but they didn't make any arrests. It wasn't long before the case went cold. In 2019, the evidence from the crime scene was examined for DNA. Blood had been found on some broken glass, some paper towels, and on the nylon stockings used to strangle Ginny. The blood belonged to the same man, but no match to the DNA was found. The police tried to find the killer through genetic genealogy, but they were not successful. Then on February 4th, 2020, 36 years after the murder, the police received a phone call. The caller said that their friend, 58-year-old Jesse Aylward, had been dying in the hospital. He confessed to killing Ginny Hannon. Aylward was 22 years old at the time of the murder. He grew up in Pembroke and he didn't live far from Ginny. However, it's not known if they knew each other. Aylward did have a criminal record, which included convictions for assault. According to his obituary, he owned a paving and seal coating business. He was also a skilled handyman. He never had children of his own. Aylward died on February 3, 2020, and his friend reported his deathbed confession the next day. So the police were able to go to the hospital to get a sample of Aylward's DNA. They compared it to the killer's DNA, and it was a match. In March 2021, the police announced that the murder of Ginny Hannon was officially closed after 37 years. Number 2. Norman Raisbeck. In 1969, Anne Sapelli lived in the small town of Moruwa in Western Australia. After high school, Sapelli got a job as a telephone operator. When she was 20, she entered the Miss Australia Quest, which is a beauty pageant. In the lead up to the pageant, she raised $1,500 for charity. On September 27, 1969, she was supposed to go in front of the judging panel. But 10 days before that, she traveled to Geraldton, which is on the coast of Western Australia. She had to write an exam to advance her career. On September 22, 1969, Sapelli and several friends went to a drive-in movie theater just outside of Geraldton. But they arrived late, and the movie had already started. Sapelli decided she wanted to leave and started walking back to Geraldton, which was about 2 miles away. A motorist saw a car with 2 men pull up behind her. Another driver saw the 2 men walking behind her. Their car was parked close by. One man was tall and he walked with a limp, and the other man was short. This was the last time 20-year-old Anne Sapelli was seen alive. 2 days later, her body was found in some bushland not far from where she was last seen. She had been raped, beaten, and strangled to death. Unfortunately, the police botched the investigation. Imprints of tire and shoe prints were not taken. They did collect her clothes, fingernail scrapings, and swabs from her body, but they were later lost. Also, Sapelli's fingerprints were not taken. This could have been important because she might have left her fingerprints behind if she was placed in a car or touched something of the killers. The police had two suspects, Thomas Craig and Norman Raisbeck. They were known to the police because they had assaulted other women. In 1967, Craig served about 9 months in jail for attacking a woman with a hammer. They also matched the description of the men seen following Sapelli. Craig was a short man, and Raisbeck was tall and he walked with a limp. Also, their car matched the description of the car that witnesses saw following Sapelli. On the night of Sapelli's murder, they left town. 4 days later, they turned up 1,800 miles away in Adelaide, South Australia. 13 days after the murder, the lead detective flew to Adelaide to interview the two men. Raisbeck told him that they had left town before the murder. Without looking into it, the detective believed them and decided to eliminate them as suspects. So their car was not examined for forensic evidence. It was later determined that their alibi was false. Unfortunately, Thomas Craig continued to attack women. 18 months after Anne Sapelli was murdered, Craig was visiting his friend, Kate Preedy, and her husband. An 18-year-old woman was also visiting. Craig started strangling the 18-year-old woman and he screamed, "I'll do to you what I did to Anne Sapelli." Preedy's husband chased Craig out of the house. They did not report the incident to the police. 4 years later, a 16-year-old girl was hitchhiking near Margaret River, Western Australia. She accepted a ride from Craig, who she knew from around town. After driving a short distance, he pulled over and got a piece of firewood from the bed of his truck. He opened the passenger door and struck the young woman several times in the head with a piece of firewood. The young woman begged him to stop, and she promised she wouldn't tell anyone. She also promised to be his friend. Craig stopped attacking her, and then he dropped her off at home. She immediately called the police. But Craig wasn't convicted of the assault because the police report didn't contain enough information. The court also wasn't allowed to hear about Craig's other convictions. In 1980, a man who wanted to stay anonymous called a radio station in Perth. The caller admitted to being involved in a murder in Geraldton. The investigators believed that the caller was Norman Raisbeck. The investigators decided to track him down and offer him a deal. If he would testify against Craig, they would give him immunity. But then, something odd happened. The lead detective on the initial investigation had the search for Raisbeck shut down. At the time, he was deputy commissioner and he was about to be appointed commissioner. He told the current investigators that he had already investigated Raisbeck and it was a dead end. So the case went cold again. In 1988, the police finally talked to Norman Raisbeck. At the time, he was 61 years old and he was dying in a hospital in Adelaide. He admitted that both he and Thomas Craig raped Anne Sapelli. Raisbeck said the last time he saw Sapelli, Craig had her in a headlock. A month after his confession, Raisbeck died. The police thought that Raisbeck's deathbed confession was enough evidence to arrest Thomas Craig for Anne Sapelli's murder. But once again, the police had made a mistake. When they were listening to Raisbeck's deathbed confession, they only took notes. It was not a sworn statement. So the deathbed confession had no legal standing and therefore couldn't be used as evidence against Craig. Since Raisbeck was dead, nothing else could be done. So the case became cold once more. In 1996, there was an internal police investigation. The initial lead detective refused to be interviewed. In 2001, a coronial inquest concluded that Craig and Raisbeck should not have been excluded as suspects. In 2012, a reporter tracked down Thomas Craig. He was working for a church, collecting donations from bins. He denied being violent towards women, and he said he didn't kill Ann Sapelli. Unfortunately, after 52 years, the murder of Ann Sapelli may never be closed because most of the evidence has been lost. However, most people believe that Thomas Craig killed her. Craig's current whereabouts are unknown. Number 1. Thomas Kikoria. In the summer of 1971, 21-year-old Thomas Kikoria was living in a mobile home in Columbus, Georgia, with his 18-year-old wife Cheryl and their 18-month-old son, Bradley. Thomas was a soldier, and he was stationed at nearby Fort Benning. On July 13, 1971, Cheryl was working overtime, and Thomas was at home with Bradley. When Cheryl arrived home after work, their neighbor told her that Thomas had taken Bradley to Martin Army Hospital on Fort Benning. Cheryl went to the hospital, and Thomas told her that Bradley had been in an accident. Thomas said that Bradley had fallen and he hit his head on a step that was 2 inches high. Sadly, 18-month-old Bradley never woke up, and he died 2 days after he was admitted to the hospital. After his death, Cheryl asked Thomas if he had done something to Bradley. Thomas said that he didn't, and he could never hurt their son. He told Cheryl that she was just imagining things. But Cheryl had good reason to be suspicious of Thomas. Bradley was born when Thomas was in Vietnam. When Thomas returned home, Bradley thought of him as a stranger, and he cried a lot when he was around. Thomas was also abusive to both Cheryl and Bradley. Bradley had been taken to the hospital several times because of injuries he sustained at the hands of his father. But Cheryl believed Thomas when he said he didn't hurt Bradley. After Bradley's death, they moved to Wisconsin and they had 2 more children. Thomas continued to be abusive. In 1987, she finally divorced him. Although Cheryl had tried to move on, she had never been able to shake the feeling that Thomas caused Bradley's death. When her son, who was born after Bradley's death, started asking how the baby died, she became more determined to figure out the truth. But she had no idea how to do that. She talked to a lawyer, and the lawyer told her to forget about it and focus on her living children. In 2009, Cheryl called the Columbus Police Department and told them about her suspicions. It had been 38 years since Bradley died. The police took her allegations seriously, and they investigated for nearly 2 years. In late 2010, they tracked down Thomas Kikoria. He was 60 years old, and he was in a VA hospital in Minnesota, dying of cancer. The detectives went to the hospital and interviewed Thomas. He was in bad shape and could mostly answer by nodding and shaking his head. He admitted that the baby wouldn't stop crying, so he punched him in the head, and Bradley lost consciousness. Thomas died shortly afterward, on November 5, 2010. The police said had he not died, he would have been charged with murder. The investigators credit Cheryl with coming forward regarding her suspicions. Had she kept quiet, they probably would have never known that Bradley was murdered. Cheryl said that the deathbed confession gave her some closure and served a little bit of justice for her son. Number 3. Thomas Rendell. In early 1969, 19-year-old Theodore John Conrad got a job at Society National Bank headquarters in Cleveland, Ohio. Conrad told several friends that the bank had lax security and he could easily rob it. None of his friends thought he was serious. Conrad was also obsessed with the movie The Thomas Crown Affair. In the film, Thomas Crown, played by Steve McQueen, masterminds a bank robbery because he's bored and to prove to himself that he can do it. At the end of the day on Friday, July 11th, 1969, the day after Conrad's 20th birthday, he walked into the vault at the bank. He packed $215,000, worth about $1.7 million in 2022, into paper bags and walked out of the bank. On Monday, the employees of the bank realized that the money was gone. The authorities were alerted. But Theodore Conrad was gone, and he had a 2-day head start. The case was assigned to a deputy U.S. Marshal named John Elliott. John interviewed Conrad's girlfriend. He had sent her several letters after he robbed the bank. His letters indicated that he stopped in Los Angeles, California, and Washington, D.C., but he didn't say where he ended up. Conrad also thought he could return to Cleveland after 7 years because the statute of limitations would have expired. But the problem was that he was indicted, so the statute of limitations no longer applied. U.S. Marshal John Elliott worked on the case for several decades. Theodore Conrad cut off all ties from his 3 siblings and divorced parents. He also didn't commit any other crimes. But even if he did, he could have continued to live in secrecy because the marshals didn't have his fingerprints on file. In the 1990s, John Elliott retired. But he continued to come into the office and look over files, hoping to see something that would crack the case. In the early 2000s, John's son, U.S. Marshal Peter Elliott, took over the case. In March 2020, John Elliott died without finding out what happened to Theodore Conrad. Then, sometime in 2021, Peter Elliott came across the obituary of a man named Thomas Rendell, who lived in Linfield, a suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. It was never made clear how Peter came across the obituary. Peter noticed some similarities between Thomas's and Conrad's lives. They both had the same birth dates, except that Thomas's birth year was 2 years before Conrad's birth year. Thomas's parents' names were also very similar to Conrad's parents' names. Thomas also had the same alma mater as Conrad and the same birth city. Peter Elliott continued to investigate Thomas Rendell and found more evidence that he was Theodore Conrad. Peter managed to get Thomas Rendell's signature and compared it to Theodore Conrad's signature. He thought that they were very similar. Peter also learned that there was no record of Thomas Rendell before January 1970. That's when he applied for a social security number in Boston, which is where he settled. Peter didn't think it was a coincidence that Conrad chose the name Thomas and moved to Boston because of his love of the Thomas Crown Affair. The main character's name is Thomas, and the movie takes place in Boston. Shortly after arriving in Boston, Thomas got a job as an assistant golf pro at a country club outside of Boston. He gave golf lessons to the members. At some point, he became manager of the country club. Thomas Rendell met a woman named Kathy, and they were married in 1982. She gave birth to a daughter named Ashley. Thomas eventually changed careers and started selling luxury cars. He did that for 40 years and he was mostly successful. Thomas played golf throughout his life. He was known for never bending the rules and he never took side bets. He was excellent at golfing. At one charity event, he beat Hall of Famer golfer Johnny Miller. Thomas spent several winters in Florida playing golf. Thomas was also a good cook who enjoyed watching cooking shows on television. He also liked the crime drama NCIS. In 2014, Thomas and Kathy filed for bankruptcy protection. They had $160,000 in credit card debt and not many assets. Many people who knew Thomas Rendell said he was the nicest guy you could ever meet. He had friends who were police officers, and even one who was an FBI agent. Peter Elliott talked to Thomas Rendell's family. They said that his wife had invited his friends over to say goodbye just before he died of lung cancer. On his deathbed, Thomas confessed that he was really Theodore Conrad, and he had robbed the Society National Bank headquarters in 1969. U.S. Peter Elliott closed the case his father couldn't, 52 years after the crime was committed. Peter said that none of Thomas's family would be charged for not informing the authorities that he confessed on his deathbed. Theodore Conrad's surviving family were informed that he had been found. They had assumed he died a long time ago. His sister thought she would die without finding out whatever happened to him. She said she was relieved to learn that he had lived a happy life. Number 2. Sharon Diane Crawford Smith. Staunton is a small city in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. In 1967, it had a population of about 25,000 people. In April 1967, 19-year-old Constance Hevener and her 20-year-old sister-in-law, Caroline Perry, were working at an ice cream shop in the city called High's Ice Cream. Hevener was married to Perry's brother. Both women were well liked and didn't appear to have any enemies. On the night of April 11, 1967, the sisters-in-law were working in the shop. Just before closing, a customer came into the store. It was open, but they couldn't find anyone working. The customer went into the back room and found the two young women lying in pools of blood. The customer called for help. 19-year-old Constance Hevener died on the way to the hospital. 20-year-old Caroline Perry arrived at the hospital but died a few hours later. Both had been shot in the head with a .25 caliber gun. $138 had been stolen. The police weren't entirely convinced that the women were killed because the robbery went wrong. It didn't appear that the women put up much of a fight, so the robber could have easily taken the money and gone away. The police also didn't think $138 was worth killing two young women. The chief of detectives, Davy Bocock, interviewed several people who were near the ice cream shop around the time of the shooting. They remember seeing a man using a payphone near the scene of the shooting. A 23-year-old unemployed school teacher named William Thomas Jr. contacted the police and said he was the person they were looking for. Thomas claimed he saw two men running away from the scene. He also later said he saw a dog who had a pair of bloody pants. Detective Bocock thought that some of Thomas's stories were unusual. Thomas then admitted that he made up some of his stories. He was given a polygraph exam. The examiner thought that Thomas enjoyed lying, and he thought that he could beat a polygraph machine. The police concluded that the only reason Thomas would lie was because he was the killer. In October 1967, 6 months after the murders, Thomas was indicted on 2 counts of murder. But the district attorney decided to only try him for the murder of Constance Hevener. This was done in case he was acquitted, that he could be tried for the murder of Caroline Perry. William Thomas went to trial for Hevener's murder in April 1968. The police had turned up more evidence on Thomas. They found a witness who was in the ice cream shop at 10:20 p.m., which is about 15 minutes before the women were found shot. The witness said she saw a man in the shop that she thought was Thomas. The police also discovered that Thomas was $700 in debt, which contributed to his motive. But a police sketch artist testified and said that the witness couldn't describe the man in the shop well enough to draw a sketch. The defense had Thomas's wife and her friend testify. They both said that Thomas was with them around the time of the murder. Thomas's father also testified. He said he wasn't a wealthy man, but he did have money and investments. His son knew if he was desperate enough for money, he could come to him. After a 4-day trial, the jury deliberated for 2.5 hours. They found William Thomas not guilty of murder. Although Thomas wasn't tried for the murder of Perry in case he was acquitted of killing Hebner, the district attorney chose not to take him to court again. Instead, he remained the prime suspect, and the indictment was held over his head. In 1980, Davy Bocock was removed from active duty. The city manager assigned him to auxiliary service. In 2006, Davy Bocock died at the age of 76. In summer 2008, 41 years after the murders, the police caught a break in the case. A woman named Joyce Bradshaw contacted the police. She said that in 1967, she worked with a woman named Sharon Diane Crawford Smith. Smith had a second job. She worked at High's Ice Cream with Constance Hebner and Caroline Perry. Bradshaw told the police that she went for dinner with Smith about a week before the shooting. Bradshaw said that Smith showed her a gun and said she had 2 bullets. One was for her stepfather, who had supposedly sexually abused her, and another was for that Hebner girl. After the shooting, Bradshaw said she told Detective Davy Bocock what Smith had said. A few days later, Bocock told her that Smith was cleared as a suspect. He said she had taken a polygraph exam and passed. Also, Smith had a gun and ballistic testing was done. Bocock told her that the bullets weren't fired from Smith's gun. Bocock then said something that Bradshaw interpreted as a threat. He told her that Smith was a good shot. So Bradshaw decided not to go back and talk to another detective. But deep in her heart, Bradshaw always knew that Smith was the killer. In November 2008, the police went to interview Smith. After the murders, she moved away from Staunton. She got married and had 2 daughters. Smith eventually moved back to Staunton. She had left her husband and she moved in with a woman whom she was in a romantic relationship with. When the police interviewed Smith, she was in a terminal care center. She was dying from heart and kidney problems. She told the investigators that she went to the ice cream shop on the night of the murders to tell them that she couldn't work the next day. She didn't explain why, but she brought her gun with her. She said that Hebner and Perry started making fun of her for being gay and they called her a lesbian. Smith said that she started fighting with Hebner. She then pulled out the gun and shot both women. She stole the money to make it look like a robbery. Smith said that sometime after the murders, she gave the gun to someone who got rid of it for her. That person was Detective Davy Bocock. The police learned that Smith and Bocock had a personal relationship. Bocock taught her how to shoot a gun on his farm. The police investigated Smith's confession and confirmed many aspects of it. The police couldn't confirm if Bocock disposed of the weapon, but they pointed out that Smith was truthful about other things in her deathbed confession. On December 12th, Smith was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. On December 30th, the indictment against William Thomas Jr. was dropped after 41 years. Sharon Diane Crawford Smith died on January 19, 2009, at the age of 60. 4 days later, the police went public with Smith's deathbed confession, and they said they were confident she was the killer. However, they still do not know how Davy Bocock was involved in the aftermath of the murders, or what he knew. Nearly 2 years later, William Thomas Jr. filed a lawsuit against the Sonic Police Department for $200 million. He claimed that Bocock knew from day one who killed Constance Heavener and Caroline Perry. He then helped Smith cover it up. That cover-up led to Bocock framing him for the murders. Thomas also alleged that Bocock and Smith had a sexual relationship. He claimed that Bocock fathered either one or both of Smith's daughters. The district attorney's office and the police department asked Smith's daughters for a sample of their DNA, but they refused to give a sample. William Thomas's case was ultimately dismissed because the statute of limitations had run out. Number 1. Amy Billig. Amy Billig was born in January 1957 in Manhattan, New York. Her parents, Ned and Susan, considered her their miracle child. Ned was a trumpet player who performed in Greenwich nightclubs. He met Susan, who was a singer, at a gig. Amy was born 10 years into their marriage. The couple had previously suffered 5 miscarriages. A year after Amy was born, Susan gave birth to a son named Josh. In 1968, Susan visited Coconut Grove, Florida, and she fell in love with the Miami neighborhood. The family decided to move there to escape New York's crime. In Coconut Grove, Ned opened a popular art gallery, and Susan was an interior designer. Amy was considered a flower child. She wrote and read poetry. She inherited her parents' musical talent as well. She played the guitar and classical flute. She loved animals, and she was a vegetarian. She volunteered at a non-profit group that transitioned dolphins that were in captivity into the wild. Amy would play music for the dolphins, and she was sure that the dolphins heard the music and responded to it. On March 5, 1974, 17-year-old Amy planned on meeting some friends for lunch at the village center. But Amy had a problem. She didn't have any money on her. She called her father at his art gallery, and he agreed to give her some money if she came by. The art gallery was a short distance from the village center. Amy walked a block to the main highway and stuck out her thumb, hoping to catch a ride. It was common for Amy to hitchhike in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, Amy never made it to her father's office. She also didn't make it home that evening, so she was reported missing. Days passed and several tips came in, but they did not lead to Amy being found. One person saw her get into a green Jeep. Another person said he saw her get into a white van. On March 16, 1994, 11 days after Amy vanished, her family received a call. It was from a woman who refused to give her name. She said that some members of the outlaw motorcycle gang kidnapped Amy while she was hitchhiking. They had taken her to Daytona Beach, Florida, and they were holding her against her will. It turned out that on the day Amy went missing, chapters of the outlaw and pagan motorcycle gangs passed through Coconut Grove on their way to Bike Week in Daytona Beach, Florida. Not long after that call, the police got another lead. A man had found Amy's camera on an off-ramp to Florida's Turnpike in Wildwood, Florida. Wildwood is about 280 miles north of Coconut Grove. He knew it was Amy's camera because her name was printed on it. The location where the camera was found was interesting because if bikers were traveling north from Daytona towards any of the interior states, they would have passed through Wildwood. But there were several problems. The first was that the camera was found on the southbound turnpike. If Amy had been kidnapped by bikers heading from Coconut Grove to Daytona Beach, the camera probably would have been found on the northbound turnpike. Secondly, Amy's family couldn't remember the last time they saw the camera, so they weren't sure if she had it on her when she went missing. The film in the camera was developed, and most of the photos were overexposed. The police and Amy's family did not think that any of the visible photos were clues to her disappearance. Then, on March 22, 1974, nearly 2 weeks after Amy went missing, Susan received another phone call. It was a man who said they were holding Amy captive. They would release her in exchange for $30,000. The family gathered the money. The next morning, Susan went to hand off the money at a hotel. She was surprised that the person who came to accept the money was a teenage boy. Susan refused to hand over the money without him proving he had Amy. The boy couldn't, so Susan kept the money and the boy ran away. Police officers were monitoring the situation. They arrested the boy and his twin brother, who was also at the hotel. They were identified as Larry and Charles Glasser, who were both 16. They had never met Amy, and they weren't involved in her kidnapping. The brothers were charged with extortion. They pleaded guilty, and they were put under house arrest. As the weeks passed, Amy's family continued receiving tips that the motorcycle gang was holding her. Specifically, she was being held by a member of the Outlaws in an apartment just outside of Orlando in Kissimmee. A detective talked to a convenience store clerk close to the apartment. She remembered seeing a girl who looked like Amy. Susan decided to travel to Kissimmee herself to talk to the clerk. The clerk said that the girl would come in every Sunday and buy vegetable soup. Susan thought that this was promising because Amy was a vegetarian. The last time she saw her was about a week earlier. Susan and a detective went to the apartment where the girl had supposedly stayed. Whoever had lived there had cleared out quickly and left many things behind. Susan found a hairbrush with some hair on it, and there were some other items as well. The detective collected them for evidence. The hairs were compared to Amy's hair, and they were similar. Susan then asked the police to get Amy's fingerprints from her bedroom. Unfortunately, because of the weather in Florida, the fingerprints in the bedroom had degraded. So a technician could not find a viable single fingerprint in her bedroom. A year went by, and Bike Week was once again held at Daytona Beach. Amy's family roamed around looking for her, but they didn't find her. On the morning of November 30th, 1975, Susan received a call from a man who said he was in the motorcycle gang, the Pagans. He had recently gone out of prison. He said that he had owned Amy while he lived in Orlando. He had bought her from another biker named Brackett. The man agreed to meet with Susan. He brought Susan to his home and described Amy accurately. This included a scar she had, and that information had never been made public. The man said that he had known Amy before he went to prison. She didn't know who she was and didn't remember her name or her family. He said when he was arrested in July 1974, a few months after Amy went missing, he handed her off to another biker named Dishrag Harry. Susan would later learn that Dishrag Harry's real name was Harry Kramer. The man told Susan he would ask around about Amy. Susan memorized the license plate of the man's bike, and after she was dropped off, she called the police. She learned that the man she spoke to was named Paul Branch. He had done time for auto theft, concealed weapons, assault, and murder. He had shot a guy in the head in a bar. He was released after 7 years because his conviction was overturned on a technicality. Branch was apparently an executioner for the pagans. He had been a Hell's Angel and formerly had Hell's Angels tattoos, but he burned them off with battery acid to avoid being killed by members of the Hell's Angels. Branch later told Susan he tracked Amy down to the West Coast. She was living with a man who didn't want to give her up. Branch said that he and a friend were heading to the area where the man and Amy lived and he would report back. But Branch never made it to the West Coast. When Susan asked him why he hadn't gone, he always had an excuse. Then Branch told Susan that Amy was in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Susan traveled to Tulsa and began looking for her daughter. Branch came to Tulsa and claimed he was there looking for Amy. Susan ended up spending over a month in Tulsa. During her stay, she lost contact with Paul Branch. She left Tulsa without being any closer to finding her daughter. In December 1976, Susan tracked down Brackett, the biker Branch claimed he bought Amy from. Brackett was in prison in Florida. He denied selling any girl to Branch. Susan continued looking for her daughter by visiting places like strip clubs in Florida and asking if anyone recognized Amy. No one could say for sure that they saw her. In the summer of 1977, 3 years after Amy went missing, Paul Branch called Susan out of the blue. He said that Amy had been in Tulsa and that she was taken to Seattle, Washington. Not long after the call, Susan found out she had heart disease. She had a bypass operation and spent a week in intensive care. Even in the hospital, she spent her time investigating by making phone calls from her bedside. Then, in mid-November, Susan traveled to Seattle. Several people said that they saw Amy, but Susan had no definitive evidence that her daughter was ever there. She returned home after a few weeks. Another year went by, and no trace of Amy was found. In May 1979, a man calling himself Hal Johnson started calling Susan. He told her he saw her daughter and gave her an address. Turned out that the address didn't exist. Hal Johnson would later call back and say obscene things to Susan. He liked to tell her that he was keeping Amy as a sex slave, or that she was part of a sex slave ring. Hal Johnson continued to call Susan for years. Every time the police traced the calls, they were traced to payphones. The 1970s ended and the 1980s passed without any trace of Amy turning up. In spring 1992, Susan was diagnosed with lung cancer. She was only given a few months to live. One day, Hal Johnson called her, and Susan told him that she was dying. She told him that if she really had information about her daughter, could he please tell her. Instead, he continued to torment her. Susan had several operations, and she survived her cancer diagnosis. But then in January 1993, Ned Billig was diagnosed with lung cancer. Hal Johnson kept calling Susan to harass her. He would mock her about her husband dying. In March 1993, 69-year-old Ned Billig passed away. On his deathbed, Susan promised that she would never stop looking for Amy. After Ned died, Hal Johnson called and laughed at Susan because she was all alone now. He told her that she better watch out. Eventually, a cold case detective was assigned to Amy's case. He also traced Hal Johnson's calls. All that was known was that the calls were coming from payphones in Kendall, a suburb of Miami. The detective set up surveillance of the payphones, but it didn't lead to Hal Johnson's arrest. The cold case detective also found Paul Branch. He was living in Gordonsville, Virginia. Branch had spent much of the 1980s in prison for murder. He got out early because he snitched on other bikers. When the detective found Branch, he had skin cancer. Branch told the detective everything he told Susan was true. He had known Amy for a short time in Orlando and then gave her to a man named Dishray Carey. In 1993, Hal Johnson called Susan again. This time, the call was traced to a cell phone. But at the time, due to technological limitations, the police couldn't trace it to a specific cell phone. But then, in October 1995, the police finally traced the cell phone. After 17 years, the caller was identified. It belonged to a 48-year-old man named Henry Johnson Blair, who worked as a customs agent. At the time, he was the top supervisor of undercover operations. Henry was interrogated, and he admitted that he made the calls. He blamed it on his obsessive-compulsive disorder, and he would get drunk and make the calls. He was adamant that he had never met Amy and had nothing to do with her disappearance. But there were some odd potential connections between Henry Blair and Amy. Henry married a woman named Cynthia shortly before Amy vanished. They returned from their honeymoon 2 days before she was kidnapped. Weeks after Amy vanished, a woman who identified herself as Mrs. Blair called Susan and said that her husband said that he saw Amy walking in North Miami. Also, just before she went missing, Amy had written in her journal about a man named Hank who wanted to take her to South America. None of Amy's friends knew anybody named Hank, but Henry Blair's nickname was Hank. When Amy went missing, Henry was a sky marshal who often traveled to South America. One of the photos found on Amy's camera was of a white van. In 1974, Henry owned a white van that was the same model as the van in the photo. Also, a witness said that they saw Amy getting into a white van. But the police never found any evidence connecting Henry to Amy's disappearance. Henry Blair was charged with aggravated stalking. He went to trial at the end of February 1996. He was ultimately found guilty of stalking, but not aggravated stalking. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Susan then sued Henry. He settled out of court for $5 million. But he didn't have that much money, so he was only ordered to pay between $6,000 and $7,500 every year. In early 1998, a British documentary team went to interview Paul Branch. But they were too late. His girlfriend told them he had died on New Year's Eve 1997. But she supposedly told the team that she had information about Amy's whereabouts. So the documentary team flew in Susan, and she talked to the woman who was never identified. Paul Branch's girlfriend told Susan that Branch had made a deathbed confession. She said that Amy and another girl showed up at a pagan party on the night she went missing. Amy started drinking and doing drugs. At one point, she got mouthy, and one of the bikers decided they would gang rape her. During the assault, Amy was given drugs several times to ensure she wouldn't fight back. At some point, she overdosed and died. So they cut up her body and then dumped the remains in the Everglades so that the alligators could eat them. The police and Susan initially believed Paul Branch's girlfriend's story. In March 1998, Amy's family had a memorial service for her. The documentary team encouraged Susan to put Amy's death date as March 5, 1974, the day she disappeared, on her tombstone. But then, it was later revealed that Branch's girlfriend was paid for the interview. Most news services do not pay for interviews because it can influence people to say things that the producer wants them to say. So the deathbed confession is considered highly questionable. One of Paul's friends was questioned, and he was sure that Amy lived with him in Orlando. He said that afterward, she was sent north, possibly to New Jersey. She was probably murdered there at some point because she had witnessed too many crimes, and her case was highly publicized. Susan wrote a book about her search for her daughter called Without a Trace. Susan Billig died in June 2005 at the age of 70. Unfortunately, many questions were left unanswered by the time she died. What happened to her daughter, and who is responsible for her disappearance? Was Paul Branch involved? If not, how did he know about her scar? Did he confess on his deathbed? Was Henry Blair responsible for Amy's disappearance? Or did he really not know Amy? If he did, how do you explain all the strange connections to him? Or were they just coincidences? Unfortunately, Susan never found out the answers to these questions. Her son and Amy's brother, Josh, continues to look for his sister. If Amy Billig is alive today, she'd be 65 years old. Number 3. Peter Lagerwey. In November 2009, 36-year-old Daniel Ames left his uncle's Adelaide, Australia shop. According to Daniel, his uncle, 68-year-old Alan Ames, asked him to come over to discuss family matters. Daniel received a call the next day that his uncle had been murdered. The police ended up arresting Daniel. Surveillance footage placed him at the crime scene, which was his uncle's shop, around the time of the murder. Daniel claimed he was innocent. The police could not find the murder weapon, nor could they find a motive for Daniel to kill his uncle. But when he went to trial in November 2011, prosecutors believed that they had one. They think that Daniel killed his uncle in an altercation over methamphetamine. Alan had been involved in the meth trade. The most damaging evidence prosecutors tied to Daniel was that he claimed to be at his uncle's shop for only about 25 minutes. But surveillance footage showed him at the shop at 9:52 p.m. and then showed him leaving around midnight. Also, the sensor light outside the shop didn't light up after he left. Had someone else come to the shop the night of the murder after he left, the light would have turned on. Prosecutors also pointed out that Daniel showered before he left his uncle's place. So the prosecutors asked him why he stayed to shower. Daniel said that place was a shithole. I'd been at a filthy workshop and I wasn't going to get into bed. The judge found Daniel guilty. The judge said, in the absence of any explanation from you, I find you were connected in some way to the deceased with methamphetamines and that the murder was some way in relation to that. Daniel was sentenced to 24 years in prison for the murder of his uncle. After serving 10 years in Mobilong prison, Daniel exhausted most of his appeals. Then in 2022, after revelations from a supposed deathbed confession, Daniel requested another appeal in the Court of Criminal Appeal based on fresh and compelling new evidence. The confession came from another drug dealer, Peter Lagerwey, who died of cancer in 2016. Lagerwey claimed he had killed Alan Ames. Daniel was familiar with Lagerwey. They had met at the gym. Lagerwey had supposedly confessed to his partner about the murder of Alan Ames, and then he died 2 days later. Lagerwey's friend, Craig Peterson, was also apparently in the hospital room, and
and heard the confession. Peterson claimed he was in shock over the confession. It took him about 5 months to come forward. Peterson then tried to tell 3 lawyers about the confession, but none of them took him seriously. Lagerwey's mother, Marie Badman, disputed Peterson's claim. She said she was in the hospital room 99.9% of the time and never heard a confession. She said her son was coming in and out of consciousness during the last couple days of his life. Lagerwey's widow, whose name was kept from the press, also claimed there was no confession. If my husband had told me, I would speak up. It never happened, she said. Another witness, whose name can't be revealed for legal reasons, said that Daniel and Lagerwey had planned to murder Alan for his meth. But then Lagerwey changed his mind and backed out. Lagerwey's deathbed confession was not the first time the police heard Lagerwey's name concerning the murder. One of the detectives who investigated the case told the court that a prison informant accused Lagerwey of the crime in 2011. However, the detective did not investigate the matter further. The information about the informant's accusation was not presented to Daniel's lawyers before his trial. It also turned out that the police also failed to investigate other leads linking Lagerwey to the murder of Alan Ames. For example, notorious criminal Rodney Clavel told police that Lagerwey was in possession of meth he stole from Alan Ames. Clavel died in 2014 in a 13-hour siege at a brothel. Clavel also told the police that Lagerwey admitted to disposing of the murder weapon. The police did not officially record this information to protect Clavel's identity, nor was this information presented to Daniel's defense team. As of November 2022, a decision on Daniel Ames' appeal is still pending. Ames is not seeking an acquittal, but a retrial. If his appeal fails, Daniel Ames must serve out the remainder of his 24-year sentence. Number 2. Frank Lowe. Frank Lowe's family's crimes go back generations. His great-grandfather and pirate, Wicked Jack Lowe, was given land in the Bahamas by the Queen of England to stop his plundering. Like his ancestor, Frank too ventured by sea when he was young. When Frank was 10, in the early 1900s, he ran away from his father and stuck onto a boat headed for Germany. However, he eventually came back to Florida. At age 17, Frank earned his shipmaster's license. At first, he used this to ferry cattle between Florida and Cuba. In 1924, Frank started to use his expertise to smuggle alcohol during the height of Prohibition. Frank worked with other smugglers such as Walter and Percy Hevelston and Dick Sawyer. The men brought suitcases of money to Havana, Cuba, and returned to Florida with alcohol. Rum running was lucrative for Frank. It also brought some notoriety. Frank once rode a Ferris wheel with Al Capone. While the public revered bootleggers, local authorities did what they could to crack down on the illegal sale of alcohol. J. H. Cox was appointed as Collier County Deputy in 1923. Cox settled into a home near Marco Island with his wife and 2 kids. Within a couple of months, Cox ran afoul with the local bootleggers. In 1924, Cox tried to arrest Dick Sawyer, who was with a group of bootleggers. The bootleggers beat Cox with their fists and cut him with razors. His wife intervened, and this ended up saving his life. Had she not stopped the mob, they would have killed him. 7 men were arrested for the assault. Frank Lowe was one of those men. He was charged with battery. Fellow bootlegger Walter Hevelston was indicted by a grand jury for attempted murder. After the beating, Cox received many threatening letters. He wasn't intimidated, but his wife feared for their safety. Tragically, Cox would not see the man who attacked him brought to justice. On February 19, 1925, J.H. Cox, his wife, and 2 young children disappeared. The name of his wife and children or their ages were ever reported. Authorities extensively searched for the Cox family. A large mud hole on Marco Island was searched, but there were no signs of the Coxes. Sheriff W.R. Maynard offered a $50 reward for anyone with information on the disappearance. In an April 18, 1925 article in the Fort Myers Press, Maynard described Cox as 50 years of age, weighing 180 pounds, 5 feet 9 inches, tall, wide face, red nose, fighting gray eyes, and of a tall, slender build. But the police did not receive any tips regarding the whereabouts of the family. With Cox out of the picture, the attempted murder charges against Walter Havelston were dismissed. The charges against the other bootleggers were also dropped. J.H. Cox and his family's disappearance remained a mystery for almost 50 years until a family secret came to light in 1973. Frank Lowe, who is now 82, was near death. Since his smuggling days, Frank married twice and had 9 children between 2 marriages. He gave up smuggling for boat building. Before he died, Frank wanted to reveal a secret. He told his son, Amos, about his involvement in the Cox family's disappearance. According to Frank, he lured Cox and his family to a ferry at Marco Island. They were soon met by Walter Havelston and his brother, Percy. Walter and Percy wanted to ensure that there were no witnesses, so they took the family to the swamp and shot them. Frank said the brothers did the shooting, and he did kill the family. He said their bodies were buried 7 miles north of the ferry, off a road leading to Marco Island. Frank Lowe died on March 14, 1973, at age 82. Frank told Amos to keep it a secret till everyone involved in the murders was dead. Amos kept it a secret until he was on his deathbed. He gave a written account of his father's deathbed confession to his half-brother Jack. Jack spoke to the press in 1996, over 20 years after his father's death. The bodies of J.H. Cox and his family have never been recovered. By 1995, the sheriff's office records of the Cox family's disappearance were long lost. The sheriff's office decided not to reopen the case because the case details were vague and the people who were involved were no longer around. The mystery still enchants the citizens of Collier County. Not everyone believes that the Havelstons murdered the family. Percy Havelston's children have denied the allegations. Some people believe that Cox and his family were given a one-way bus ticket out of town and never heard from again. It's been nearly 100 years since the Cox family went missing, and many details surrounding their disappearance remains a mystery. Number 1. Konstantinos Barkas. In 1991, Carrie Needham and her son Ben moved with their parents from England to the Greek island of Kos. Carrie's parents, Edward and Christine Needham, were restoring an old farmhouse on the island. On the morning of July 24, 1991, the young mother went to her job at a nearby hotel, leaving her toddler son in the care of her parents. The grandparents let the 21-month-old run in and out of the farmhouse for most of the day. But around 2:30 p.m., they noticed Ben was missing. Initially, they assumed that Ben went to the beach with his uncle, Stephen. But when Stephen returned alone, they knew something was wrong. The family searched for him, hoping he wandered off and he was somewhere close. When they couldn't find him, they contacted the police. The police combed the area, finding no traces of the child. After a week of searching, the police extended their search by going house to house, looking for any sign of Ben. At this point, the police believed that the boy had been kidnapped. Border posts were notified, and television stations broadcasted information about the missing child. The police chief said, "It's very strange. Everybody around here knows the baby has disappeared, but we still have no new information." Ben's father, 21-year-old Simon Ward, flew to Cost to help with the search. Carrie and Ward had an on-again, off-again relationship. In April 1991, he flew to Cost and worked as a laborer. He flew back to England the day before Ben disappeared. After a week of searching, the police brought in the army and volunteers to aid in the search. They dug up numerous sites on the island. Yet, there was no sign of the missing child. Speculation began circulating over the whereabouts of Ben. Ben's grandmother, Christine Needham, suspected he was kidnapped. The boy's father, Simon Ward, swallowed down rumors that Ben was sold to a childless couple. After a few weeks of searching, Ben's family finally left the island due to a family illness. Ben's mother, Carrie, never gave up hope and campaigned to find her son. Hundreds of sightings of Ben popped up in Greece over the preceding years. In 1995, there were reports of a 6-year-old boy living with gypsies in northern Greece. However, DNA tests proved that it wasn't the missing child. There were other sightings, but DNA testing always provided the same result. In 2011, Carrie Needham asked British Prime Minister David Cameron for help. He offered help from the South Yorkshire Police, and they pressed the Greek authorities to cooperate. In 2012, more than 20 years after Ben's disappearance, British police, working along Greek police and a team of specialists, conducted their first dig on the site where Ben disappeared. The investigators learned that Ben might have been accidentally run over by a construction vehicle and buried. But after a week of searching, no trace of the child was found. A second dig was ordered in 2016. The dig was initiated after the police got a lead from a supposed confession regarding Ben's death. Greek authorities questioned a person who said his friend worked as a digger operator on the day Ben disappeared. According to this person, their friend, Konstantinos Brachis, admitted to accidentally running over the child with a digger. Allegedly, Brachis was clearing a path near the family farmhouse when he thought he heard a yelp. He thought it was a dog. This was the breakthrough everyone involved in the case was waiting for. The only problem was that Brachis died of stomach cancer in 2015. Brachis' friend said he only confessed on his deathbed. Brachis' wife said that her husband was a good man and said he wasn't involved in the toddler's disappearance. The friend who brought the information to the police eventually stopped cooperating with them. South Yorkshire Police and Greek authorities dug up 2 areas of land where building waste had been dumped. The team dug up 800 tons of soil, but Ben's remains were not found. 60 items were unearthed, and they were all reviewed by forensic specialists. One interesting item discovered at the site was a toy car believed to have belonged to Ben. A weak DNA sample was found on the toy car. The family hoped it would be the breakthrough in the case, but it wasn't Ben's DNA. Also tested was a sandal. Strong DNA signals were found on the leather strap. The head of the forensics group said that they found a profile indicative of human blood decomposition on a fragment of the sandal. The DNA did not belong to Ben either. Nevertheless, the South Yorkshire Police believe that Ben was accidentally buried in the waste. In a statement to the press, Deputy Inspector John Cousins, the officer leading the inquiry, said, "It is my professional opinion that Ben Needham died as a result of an accident near the farmhouse where he was last seen playing." The search ended in October 2012. More than 30 years later, the Needham family still has trouble believing that Ben was buried in the construction waste. Carrie Needham still believes that her son is alive. In 2021, she told the Daily Mirror, "I still have that hope that Yorkshire police are wrong, and while there is no evidence to show me, I have to believe he is still alive. There's not a single thread of evidence to say otherwise." She also admitted to being stuck in 1991. "I never had any dreams or goals apart from finding Ben," she said. As of December 2022, no trace of Ben Needham has ever been found. If Ben is still alive at the time of this video, he'd be 32 years old. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out our new channel, Paranormally Listed. There's a link on the screen now, and there's a link in the description box below this video. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.